Hello, everybody. I am joined today by Donald James Parker, the maker of the Gramps Goes to College movie that I made a video about. I can't even tell you how long ago that was. Was that last year? I don't even remember. It's been so much between now and then. Thank you so much for meeting with me. I sincerely appreciate you.
Well, thank you for hosting me.
So before we get started, please tell everybody about you. Tell us who you are and what you do and why you're here.
I'm not sure your audience really wants to know all that, but I can fling it out here and see if any of the spaghetti sticks to the wall. I have a very unusual situation. I was trained as a teacher, taught school for a while, and then I got into the world of computers, and I programmed for 30 some years. And I was kind of I might consider myself a lukewarm Christian at times. It was kind of like a roller coaster ride. I'd get excited about my religion and then up and down, depending on where I was in life. And when I was 56, I woke up one night. I looked at the clock. It was 2 a.m. exactly. And I'd heard a voice, or I dreamt I heard a voice. I still don't know. It said, write a book about evolution. Well, I wasn't really a writer. I didn't know much about evolution whatsoever. I did know that it was 2 a.m. and I was sound mind, so I just rolled over and went back to sleep. The next morning, when I woke up, that episode was so clear in my memory banks. I just, for some reason, I didn't really expect an answer, but I just cried out to God and said, Lord, did you ask me to write a book about evolution last night? And I didn't expect, like I said, I didn't expect an answer. I thought it'd just be silent crickets, and I just go on, eat my breakfast and go for a run or something. But just as clear as a bell, this inaudible voice went through my head. And when you're done with that, I want you to go after Harry Potter and the sexual revolution. So I went from a workaholic computer programmer to a programmer who tried to work about 8-hour days and spent the rest of my workaholic hours at the keyboard typing first a novel. And so I wrote a book about evolution called All the Voices of the Wind. And that was where I started. And I wrote several more after that. And then, reading's kind of become a lost art. It's people, we're in the microwave world. We want instant entertainment. You can watch a movie in 2 hours. A book could take you 2 weeks, So lots of people don't appreciate books anymore. So I decided, maybe I need to get into movies. So I did that, and now I've produced, I've lost track, 13 or 14. I can't remember. But mainly my topics have been, evolution, the sexual revolution, and the occult. Harry Potter being part of the occult. So, but I also, in doing that, I also got into church doctrine because I see lots of things in the church that really bothered me that I had to also bring out. So I like to call a spade, and sometimes it gets you into hot water.
You know what though? My handle on like TikTok and everything that got me started was Renegade Science Teacher, and it was for that exact reason, because I wanted to teach all the science that I loved. And I live in Oklahoma, which is like the buckle of the Bible Belt. And I would get in trouble with the companies I worked for a children's museum. I worked for different educational companies and everything. And when I would teach something that a religious person might not like, they'd be, you're going to lose us money and all this stuff. And so I did the same thing in the exact opposite direction. I wanted to teach the real stuff. I don't care if it gets me in trouble. I wanted to do the real thing. So like, I love that. I think you and I are both, cut from the same cloth in that way, that we're all, we're very excited to go talk about what we're passionate about and to try to fix what we see as problems in the world, despite the fact that we see very different problems. I think you and I, a lot of the things that I think are good, I think you think are bad, and vice versa.
I think you probably went there quite willingly, where I had to be kind of dragged. It's like,
maybe so.
It's like, Lord, I don't really want to do this, but I felt compelled, and maybe so.
So I tell you what, I have a million.
Sure,
go ahead. Sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you off.
Well, I just, in my former life, I never had death threats before and people wishing I was dead. So that's a new experience for me. So
tell me about it. Dude, having to ask for security at conventions is a weird new thing for me in the past couple of years. The amount of people that sincerely want me, harmed is it. You don't know me. What are you doing? Like, it's so weird. It's very strange. So I have a million questions about what you just said, but none of it's super relevant to the topic at hand. So for right now, I'm going to just stick with evolution. And if we get back there, awesome, because you're talking about the sexual revolution, you're talking about Harry Potter and occult stuff. That sounds like a lot of fun to talk about, genuinely. But none of it's on topic for right now. So like, if we get there, awesome. But for right now, I would love to just kick us off and just ask, like, what is the major issue for you with the theory of evolution? Like, why is that something that just compels you to go out and speak out against it?
Here's the deal, Forrest. I have no problem with people teaching evolution as something that this may explain the origin of life and how we got to where we are today. But when you prevent people, you preclude people from bringing in a counter argument, such as God, creation, I got a problem with it. When it's like you're trying to squelch the truth here by potential truth. It's somebody's used the analogy. It said, "Oh, what if we had, if God is the answer, if God created everything, and you've said God can't be because he's supernatural, he's outside of the natural world, and we have to use natural means to describe everything." It's like taking our number system and saying, "We're going to remove the number 4. Now, what's the answer to 2 plus 2?"
Right.
You can't answer it because you're taking the answer out. And I did, like I said, I didn't know anything about evolution to speak of. I just knew I didn't really believe in it, but I didn't know what it was all about. And I didn't know what was going on in the academic world as far as, persecution and, people being ostracized if they believed in creationism. I didn't know any of that stuff. So I had, eye-opening experience. My first book was basically about some teenagers that studied and went through, and they went through evolution and studied the different things, radiometric dating and the fossils and everything. Everybody has a group of kids, and everyone took a different topic, and so they did this research and came up with these things. It was my journey. I was doing all this stuff, reading all these books and stuff, and reading about this, visiting the Discovery Institute and so on, and so. Yeah. So, but like I said,
well, I just mean to say that, like, so right off the bat there was a couple of things that stuck out to me, and I'd like to press you on them a little bit.
Sure.
You said, talking about evolution as the origin of life. First of all, evolution has nothing to do with the origin of life. Evolution is about what happens after life's already gotten started. The origin of life has a variety of theories going behind it. The most prevalent one being abiogenesis, how life comes from non-life through chemical evolution mainly. But like, so is that a hitch in the giddy up there to say, like, they're not talking about that if they're talking about evolution. They're only talking about how life diversifies and how it changes over time through successive generations.
So that's the first thing that I learned in this whole topic. You have to define your platitudes, because otherwise you got people talking two different things, and they may be not even arguing with each other. They're talking about two different things, but they use the same word, evolution. And like I saw a video the other day is talking about, basketball players now, they're much taller, they can jump higher, so on. So they're evolving. And I'm going,
that doesn't make any sense.
Well, yeah, because I never saw a 6'4" girl walking around when I was a kid, but now you see them. You look on the volleyball courts, and every team in the nation's got somebody that's about 6'4" on the girls' team, and some several, and then it's like, obviously the human bodies are evolving. And I don't know why. It's due to nutrition or exercise or whatever it is, but. Definitely, our bodies have changed. We've gotten, like you'd see football players that were 260, and it's like, wow, those guys are huge. Now, if they're under 300 pounds, forget about it. You're not going to play an offensive line.
Yeah.
So,
that is change, but that's not evolution. So, like that is due to increased nutrition.
So you got to get down and say, well, what do you mean by evolution? So the standard definition of that I've heard and that I've embraced is that it is the non-directed mutations that have caused the diversity of life. That we had that their DNA mutates. No, I'm not using the word random, but non-directed. And through those mutations, if a creature has the mutation comes along, it's advantageous, allows him to survive, so they can have progeny, and it passes on those traits to his offspring, and then it's just a continual process from that point. As you have continual mutations and advancements.
So that's one of the mechanisms of evolution. No, not really. Okay. So that's one of the mechanisms of evolution, and that's a very common way of framing it that isn't quite right. The actual definition of evolution is any change in the heritable characteristics of a population over the course of multiple generations. And what that means is usually DNA in terms of heritable characteristics. But there's also epigenetic changes and other things, but let's just say DNA for now. Any change to the overall genetic makeup of a population of organisms over the course of multiple generations. A lot of the times that is driven by the mutation selection mechanism, but natural selection is just one of the mechanisms of evolution. So you could have other things like gene flow, for example, that can end up changing the metagenome, the total combined genome of the whole population. And so that's all evolution is. It's any change, good or bad, doesn't matter. If you have this population of organisms and over a few generations, the total genome of those organisms have changed in any way at all, that's evolution. And so when we talk about, humans getting taller and taller, that is a change, but that's more to do with modern medicine and nutrition than it is with anything in genetics. Because for it to be a genetic change like that, we would have to find some reason to say that, these super tall volleyball players are having more children and passing on those genes more, and that doesn't really make any sense. So that's the reason why I pick at that is not only because it's important to get the definition solids if we're going to talk about evolution, but also there are other mechanisms. There are other ways that evolution works besides just that simple mutation selection. Mutation selection is huge, very important, and I would love to go into that with you, but there's a lot more to it, and I wonder if that's something that you've been exposed to.
Not really. You used a couple terms there I've never really heard: epigenetic and
so epigenetics is a change to not what the actual gene sequence is, but a change to how it's expressed. So what you can do,
genes are turned on or off.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so it's like it's like having your computer code, but you never access the file. You know what I mean? It doesn't matter if you have the code there. Right. I don't know anything about computers. I'm going to do a bad job making that analogy. But saying that if you have this gene that's turned off, or if it's overexpressed, if it's expressed more than something else. And so a great example of that is if someone smokes while they're pregnant, that causes an epigenetic change that will cause a higher incidence of obesity, not only in their daughter, but in their grandchildren as well. And so you have this for 2 generations now, you've caused a morphological, a body change in your children that isn't actually a mutation, but it's because of the stressors that you introduced while pregnant. And so when we talk about evolutionary change over time in an environment, we can talk about those kind of stressors. It's not like a lizard's out here smoking, but something comes along and makes this epigenetic change that can change the presentation of an organism. And that's really important because in evolution, it's the phenotype, it's the physical body that gets selected for, not the genes. The genes cause the physical body, but not all of them and not all the time. And so it's a really important distinction. Does that make any sense what I'm saying?
Okay.
I bring this up because a lot of times I find that people who are distrustful or disbelieving in evolution, and I hate the word belief in this case, but it's neither here nor there. I find that a lot of the times they have heard this straw man, ridiculous version of it. And so you hear people like, Stephen Meyer get up there and say, oh, well, you can't randomly change computer codes, therefore you can't randomly change DNA. It's that's not anything like how this works. Of course you don't believe in it if that's what you think it is, because that sounds crazy. And I wonder if that's kind of the same thing that's happened here, that you've heard this watered down BS version of evolution from people like the Discovery Institute. And so it makes sense that you don't think it's real, because what you think of it is something we can both agree is ridiculous.
Well, what I know for sure is that evolution has been used as a rationale to discredit the existence of God.
Sure, it has, and that's stupid.
That's why it's in my target range.
Yeah, and that's wrong. I think that's
it's wrong that people would say there is no God, because if evolution is true, then God can't exist. Is that?
Yeah, so let me be clear. I am extremely atheist, and I'm an atheist activist, but none of that has anything to do with evolution. To say evolution is real, therefore God isn't, it makes as much sense as saying God is real, therefore evolution isn't. There are people who believe in theistic evolution, where they believe that God drove evolution and guides it the way that it does. There are deists out there that believe that God started the universe in such a way that evolution would happen naturally. That's a big sticking point for me in a lot of videos that I do, where the exact opposite argument is done. I've got, in the same series that I talked about your movie, very often people will say, here's this reason why I don't believe in evolution, therefore the Bible is true. And that makes just as little sense. You know what I mean? So both can be true. I have an issue with the God hypothesis, but that's potentially another conversation, but like, I think that's equally dumb to say evolution is real, therefore God isn't. That doesn't make any sense, because they're not mutually exclusive hypotheses. And they certainly aren't, one isn't contingent on the other, if that makes any sense.
Well, it's very interesting. There are people like Dawkins will say there's no way that God and evolution can coexist. And I agree with him, that's using the theory that I told you before. But then you got Francis Collins, who's an evolutionist, but he's a Catholic, a strong Catholic.
Yeah.
I reached out and I talked to both Francis Collins and, I forget the other gentleman. There was another gentleman who's Catholic that was a big proponent of evolution. And I pointed out to him, I says, you have this Nicene Creed. I believe in God, the Father, creator of heaven and earth and all things visible and invisible. But now you're saying you believe in evolution, but you have this creed that you recite at church. I mean, they're not compatible. You got to choose one or the other, dude.
Are you of the mind that one can't exist without the other? That God exists, therefore evolution doesn't?
I don't have all the answers. I will be free to admit that I don't know exactly how God works in mysterious ways, but I know that if he created something, it didn't evolve with non-direct, with no directional activity. If he created something that evolved to a certain, from this place to this, it was directed by him, because he created everything. So
you'd be more okay with theistic evolution than natural selection, if you had to pick one.
Well, if I had to choose, it's like choosing between having your tooth pulled out without Novocaine, or having
right.
So I'm not fond of either. But my quotation on natural selection is, it doesn't teach us anything about life; it teaches us about death. Because that's what natural selection is. If it survives, it was not selected. I mean, it was selected if it survives, but if it dies, it wasn't selected. Yeah. So it's death. Death is natural selection.
It's a part of it, for sure, and it's a necessary part, but I don't think that's the whole game. What I'm trying to drive at here is just to put this in simple terms. Like, if I were able somehow magically to completely disprove the notion of a God to you, if I could make you an atheist today, would you then start accepting evolution, or do you think those are two different questions?
I tell you what, if you could discount God to me, remove him from my mindset, this world would be I would have no answers. It's like, how did the universe come to exist? You talk about the life came through the chemical biogenesis deal, which breaks the law of biogenesis. I mean, you had, at some point in time, the law that we know, life gives life. It had to be broken one time in order for that to be happen. The old, what came first, the chicken or the egg? That's a conundrum.
Not really at all. So like the but that's not what I'm asking. What I'm asking is like, aren't those
Right.
different things to say like, and I'm happy to address it. I'm not dodging those. If you want to hammer me on those questions, I'd be happy to answer them. But like what I'm asking is just like, for me, if you could prove that God was real to me, I'd have an issue with that for totally different reasons. But I would still have all the evidence that I have for evolution and say, okay, well, this is clearly a thing. So if this God is real, he did it. So like, I think those are very different concepts, and I have no issue with separating them. And I wonder why is that so ingrained for you that one kind of falls upon the other?
Well, there was a thing when I was in a Chamber of Commerce back in my hometown. They had a competition. It was a not debate, but like a declam type of thing, oratory speaking contest. And the topic was life without God has no purpose and no meaning. And that's what I embrace. I mean, if God doesn't exist, this whole thing is an insane asylum. If I don't continue to exist, after this life, what does anything matter? Nothing matters. There is no purpose. There is no reason, no raison d'etre.
Yeah.
So, people say, well, that's a crutch. You're hanging on to God because you got nothing else. Well, I think he's pretty much enough to hold on to. I mean, the concept that somebody loves me and that somebody has got a place reserved for me to live for eternity, but I need to, keep my hands and my feet to myself like I learned in kindergarten and do what he's told me to do. Because we don't want a bunch of bad dudes up in heaven, because heaven can't be heaven if you got a bunch of, Hell's Angels and M13 guys running around there creating mayhem. It's like heaven is a place where people love. There's peace, there's joy, there's happiness. So that's my whole goal. I started out I would grab a hold of God even if I never been taught anything, because I'm like.
So the thing is that I agree with half of what you said about no meaning and no purpose and all those things. I actually like that. That's good for me. I'm a cosmic nihilist, and that's great for me. The other half of what you said.
When you die, will be great for you, though, Forrest.
Oh well, I'm dead. I'm fine with that. I have no.
Well, what if you're not?
The other half of what you said.
What if you're not dead when you die? What if you're just relocated?
You mean to say, like, what if heaven's real and I've spent this whole time not believing in it?
Yeah. Well, I'm not worried about
or hells.
I'm not worried about whether you believed in him. Now it's when you die. At the point where you die, do you believe in him now? Have you accepted him now? So,
that's the because
I don't want
if you can prove that God is real, I'm into it. But like I'm not into it, but I would understand it.
Nobody can prove anything to anybody. We all can be taken evidence, but we all choose to accept what is real and what isn't. So, it's like I saw you had the Round Earther shirt on the other day in one of the videos that you did.
Yeah.
People that believe in the flat earth drive me absolutely berserk. It's like, how can you not see that? It is insane for you not to believe it. You can't prove it to them. No, it doesn't matter if you got shots from NASA. NASA's trying to do a flim-flam trick on us, they're conning on us. I'm like, why? What is their motive? What do they gain by us thinking the earth is round when it's really flat? And how do we get day and night? How do we get the seasons? I mean, how do you get an eclipse? Is it like there's so many things? They'll say, well, there's no direct flight from such and such Guatemala to such and such a place in Africa that proves that the earth is flat, because they can't fly from there to there. I'm like, what? It's because there's no demand for those flights.
The issue is, like, for me, is I agree with what you say, that some people are going to dig their heels in. They're going to believe no matter what. My job as a scientist is to not do that on purpose. And so, like, that's the whole thing about when you're studying science, is you never accept a hypothesis. You fail to reject it. You're only always looking to prove yourself wrong, and you only move forward with an idea when you can't do that anymore. And so, like, to I think it's a fundamental difference between, people who are willing to go out and look for actual answers versus people who start with the answer and then go out and looking for a reason to keep on to it. And that's what's so cool about, all of science, but that's a whole other thing. The thing that I wanted to point out was, like, a minute ago, you're talking about heaven and all these things. And like that to me is awful. I hate every thought of that. And so, like, you and I have this fundamentally different idea of what is good and what afterlife would sound nice and all these things. And even the way you described the ideal heaven sounded to me like something that I wouldn't ever want to be a part of. And so, like, we have this very different view of what's good and what would be good and what we like and what we prefer. I'm trying to find, like, a middle ground where we can agree on something, and that way we can move forward with our understanding of what life does and how life works, rather than getting caught up in a philosophical discussion about, like, what God should be or what heaven is. Does that make sense? I'm just saying that, like, I appreciate your passion and everything you're saying here, but the question that I was trying to lead you to, or trying to ask you, was, why is God so separate from evolution? Because it seems to me that you, rather than looking at evolution for what it is, are saying, well, this is incompatible with my faith, therefore I can't do it. And I'm wondering, if I can show you some more stuff about how evolution works, would you be willing to incorporate that rather than reject it because you have this faith over here that says something different?
Well, it depends on what you try to incorporate. Like, if you take, for instance, the mutation thing, you'd say, okay, we started out as, life was all one-celled creatures, and it just evolved from there, and all of a sudden, somehow those cells clumped together and became some other type of organism, which became some other type of organism, and it's just over billions of years we've leapfrogged from goo to you.
Well, let's break that down then. Let's try to dig into it and see if it makes sense. Because, like, so I'm sure there are certain things we can agree on.
Yeah. So I look at that and I go, I don't care if God's involved or not. I'm a rational person here. I have logical skills here, and I look at the heart, and I look at the blood, and I look at the brain and the lungs and so on, the liver. If we took any one of those things out of our body right now, we wouldn't be here, because we can't live without the blood, and the blood can't exist without being cleansed by the liver, and it doesn't do any good unless it gets oxygen in from the lungs, and the brain directs the whole thing, and it has to have that oxygen. So all those things are dependent on the other system, and that's not even mention some of the other things like our digestive system, and then how do we reproduce? And so how can something like that gradually come to be? It either has to be, we can't take, like, we can't just put in the heart and say, okay, we got the heart now. It's not like a construction project where, you got, okay, bring in the subcontractor who's doing the heart now. And now, okay, now bring in the liver. And then, so we just build a little bit at a time. They all have to come in at the same time, and they all have to work together. I mean, it's not just not those things. You got, what about the capillaries and the veins and all that? I mean, we got miles of blood vessels in our body. It's incredible how much.
Oh, trust me, I know. Yeah. So but this is exactly what I'm talking about. Like, this is such a common, like, unbelievably common, fundamental misunderstanding of how evolution works. It's what I'm saying from the beginning, is that, like, I think the way that you're thinking about evolution is wrong, and so it makes sense that you don't accept it. Because if you told me that and I knew nothing about evolution, I'd agree with you. That makes no damn sense. But the fact of the matter is,
explain how we got from one-celled creatures to us, then.
Yeah, sure, no problem. So let's start with the fundamentals. Let's find some common ground to agree on here. If let's say DNA, we both agree that DNA exists. Yeah.
Well, yeah.
And that's, for lack of a better word, the blueprint for a living organism, right? The only difference between any two organisms, really fundamentally, is just their DNA. So if you had the DNA to be a sponge, you'd be a sponge. You happen to have the DNA to be a human, so you're a human, right? So the DNA is the thing that makes an organism, makes it what it is. We know that it's broken
so what is
down
DNA comprised of? Yeah, what's DNA comprised of?
Nucleotides, mainly. So it's a sugar phosphate backbone with nitrogenous bases in the middle.
is there information involved?
Well, that depends on what you mean, because when we say the word information, oftentimes what that ends up being is that we mean something that's deliberately written out. When at the end of the day, literally anything can carry information. If I see a fairy ring on the ground, that's just how mushrooms grow naturally, but I can choose to derive meaning from it and do a certain thing when I see it and call that information. So yes, there is a coded sequence in DNA, but that does not imply any intentionality behind that sequence. And the same thing is like proteins. Proteins are sequences of amino acids that the sequence is very important, but it doesn't imply intentionality or anything else. Does that make sense?
Well, the definition makes sense, the description, but the application, I'm not sure does.
Okay, we'll get there. We'll get there. I promise you. So we understand that DNA exists and that it's made of genes, individual sections that do certain things. And I'm sure we agree that genes come in different flavors called alleles, right? So there's a allele for brown hair, for black hair, for blonde hair, green eyes, brown eyes, blue eyes, so on and so on, right? So like, if we can agree on all that, which I'm assuming, I don't want to put words in your mouth. Everything I've said there, that makes sense to you. We're all on the same page, yeah?
That'll work.
Sick. So then wouldn't it also stand to reason to say that different alleles, different sequences of DNA are better suited for life in different environments? You can have all the best alleles to be a penguin, you're going to die in the Amazon. And if you have all the best alleles to be a camel, you're going to die in the Mariana Trench, right? Because you don't have the right alleles to be in that particular place. That also would make sense then, yeah?
Okay.
So then wouldn't it logically follow that, and this is just the fundamental neo-Darwinian evolution. This is like the most basic parts. Again, like I said earlier, there's a bunch of other stuff, but at just this face value here, doesn't it logically follow then that if an organism has the right alleles for living in the right environment, they're going to live and they're going to reproduce and have more organisms with those alleles. And if they have the wrong alleles, they're going to die. They're not going to reproduce. Those alleles will be deleted from that environment. And eventually you'll have an environment full of organisms with the specific alleles specifically for life in that specific environment, and it'll look almost created. Wouldn't that be the logical conclusion to those basic axioms?
But how did those alleles get created in the first place? Where did they come from?
I'm happy to cover it, but like I just want to make sure, like, again, I'm just trying to make sure step by step I'm not losing, we're not separating and going different paths. Wouldn't that be the case?
That sounds likely.
Cool.
Though
So then we talk about
we do see adaptations where, like take the armadillos or something like that. The armadillos are steadily moving northward.
Yeah.
They were adapting from their normal range out down in Mexico or whatever, coming up into Tennessee and places where it's totally different fauna and flora. It's why and how.
So when we talk about how new alleles arise, and when we talk about how things are able to break into new sequences, let's cover mutation, for example. Like, are you familiar with the different types of mutations that are possible?
Enlighten me.
Sure. So there's lots of different ways that DNA can change. And I'm talking about actual changes to the gene sequence, not the epigenetic stuff from later on, but actual changes to DNA itself. There's what's called a point mutation, which is just one single letter changing. So you have that 1 point mutation, could be a silent mutation, which means it has no actual effect. Nothing changes at all. Because remember, at the end of the day, DNA codes for amino acids, which makes proteins and things. So like, if it changes the letter, but it didn't actually change the amino acid being coded for, there's no real difference. But a different mutation, single point mutation, could come along and change that and make now this one mutation that was silent actually means something now. And now it means twice as much thing, Or it could be a missense mutation, which means it changes the amino acid being coded for. So it changes the protein structure that it creates. Or it could be what's called a nonsense mutation, which means it stops production of a protein at that point. So now everything south of that is completely destroyed. So those are three different types of just one single letter changing. You also have what are called duplication events, where a piece of DNA gets copied twice. You have a deletion event where a piece of DNA doesn't get copied at all. You have an inversion event where it gets copied backwards. You have translocation where one chunk from one part of your DNA gets moved to another part of a different part of DNA. You could have whole chromosomes get translocated on top of one another. Like chromosome number 2 in humans is 2 chromosomes stacked on top of one another. It's called a Robertsonian translocation. So there's a variety of ways that DNA can change. It's not just a random jumbling. It's either one letter or a sequence of letters, either being duplicated, deleted, inverted, moved, changed, whatever. And any of those changes could do something, or it could do nothing, or it could be good, or it could be bad. So there's a wide variety of changes that can happen. And when you think about that, does it stand to reason to you when we talk about what we talked about earlier with, different alleles being better suited for life in different environments? Does it stand to reason to you to say that if you have an organism, say, a macaw living in the rainforest that's pretty good at cracking nuts, and then there's one of these huge amounts of mutations that could possibly make their beak a little bit stronger, and now this one has a stronger beak, cracks more nuts, gets more food, lays more eggs, and then has more children, and those children also have this good beak gene, wouldn't that make sense? Wouldn't that be the logical conclusion to that as well?
And that's simplistic explanation, perhaps. But let me ask this question.
It is very simplified. It is very oversimplified. You're right.
Yeah. Doesn't DNA exist in each cell?
Most of them, yeah. Almost every cell in your body has DNA. There are a few that don't. So red blood cells, things like that don't. So
would that change, that mutation be not confined to one cell at a time?
No. So the mutation happens in germ cells and gametes, sperm and eggs, or other things that don't use those. But like whenever you're talking about reproduction, that's when these things matter. So a single cell organism obviously is going to be doing clonal evolution. They're not changing the same way as us. But speaking just in terms of something simple like humans, you would have a change in the DNA of a sperm or an egg cell that would then be carried on. And yes, that mutation would be present in every cell in your body. But that's also where epigenetics comes in. Your bone cells have the exact same DNA as your skin cells. The reason why your skin isn't bone is because certain genes are turned off in one and turned on in the other. And so, you could have a change to the cells that function, make this beak function, the muscle cells, the strength of the keratin, whatever it may be, that would not be carried over to everything else. And it would only happen in the offspring. So the parent that has that mutation in their germ cells wouldn't notice it. The offspring would be better off.
Okay, so let's use a less simplistic example here. The Bombardier beetle has this acid that it produces in its body that can squirt it out to thwart its enemies. Yeah. Well, in order to use this acid, it has to have an acid-proof compartment to store that acid. Mm-hmm. So, first of all, it had to have the compartment, mm-hmm. and then the acid had to come along, and then it had to have the mechanism for squirting it out, spitting it at his opponents, a gun. How does something like that, is that just a fantastic coincidence that it just happened to have these mutations come along that created this compartment? And then the compartment is just sitting there going, well, I'm not being used for anything. It'd be nice if I had some acid come along. But the body,
the beetle had to go down to the butt compartment store and buy a new butt compartment and all that. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So what you're talking about here is exactly the same as earlier on when you were talking about how you need the lungs and the heart and the brain and the blood all working together. Yep. This is what we talk about when we talk about complexity. Usually the creationist term is irreducible complexity. If I take any one part of this out, it falls apart. Yes, exactly. The problem with that is that what you're doing is you're looking at something as it is right now and assuming that all those parts exactly in that order and only that order are the only way that this thing can work. So let me draw an example and then I'll come back to that. An example that I would take here is like the eye, for example. When we look at the eye, it's very common. People say this is so complicated and so complex. There's all these muscles and lenses and different types of tissues that are all doing this specific thing. And it either all comes at once or it doesn't. When in reality, we can look across the animal kingdom and we see a simple patch of photosensitive cells, because light's always there all the time, right? All we're doing is learning to use it as a resource. So you have a simple patch of cells that are sensitive to light, and you can use those cells to detect shadows overhead, which helps you defend against predators. Lizards, a lot of lizards like iguanas and monitors and whatnot have a parietal eye, a third eye on top of their head, which is exactly that. It detects shadows. It tells you when a bird's coming in overhead. It also helps you keep track of day and night cycles, keep your body rhythm going. So a simple patch of photosensitive cells is all you start with, utilizing a resource that's already there. Then you get a little divot as that eye starts to form kind of a cup shape, as it kind of dents in a little bit. Now you can tell which direction that light's coming from. And as it divots a little bit more, as the hole in the middle comes in, I don't know if you ever wear glasses or anything like that, but if you take glasses off and you look through a pinhole, you can see really well, because the finer the aperture, the better resolution you get. And so you have a pinhole camera eye, which is something that you still see on like Nautilus today. The cup eye is something you still see on like planarian worms and things. And then you can start to fill that little cup in with fluid and maybe put a little lens on the end, something that you still see basic lens eyes and like snails and things like that, that allows you to kind of focus that light a little bit better. And then you add ciliary muscles that can squeeze that lens, and a cornea on the top, like you see in humans today, that allow you to change the focus over time. And so we can look out in the animal kingdom today and see lots of different kinds of eyes, from very simple to very complex. And we can see these in the fossil record as well. And so when we talk about complex systems like the bombardier beetles whole thing, it's really easy to do the same thing and look at it exactly as it is now and say, well, did he get the compartment first or the acid first? When it's a lot easier to look across the animal kingdom and say, oh, well, there's lots of different things that can shoot bodily fluids in really gross ways. And it would be very easy to make that, fluid a little bit more acidic over time. We have, special adaptations in our stomach that allows our stomach acid to not eat our way through our stomachs. We produce bile. We have this rough internal layers. So we understand that it's very easy. You don't have to have a special compartment. You just have to have the same compartment that everybody else has, and then adapt that compartment at the same time that you're adapting the acid, which would make sense. If you were doing one, then the other would necessarily follow. And indeed, we have a word for that. It's called mosaic evolution. And we see it across a lot of different examples where different things evolve at different rates and different times. And it all ends up doing this one complicated thing because different adaptations build on one another. So when you look at it from the front end, like you're doing, yeah, it sounds fantastical. But if you look across the animal kingdom and you see all these different stages that are still around today, and you kind of build it up in this framework of understanding that different adaptations can stack upon each other, it makes a lot more sense. Did anything that I just say there sound unreasonable?
Well, yeah, the whole premise is unreasonable because take the back to the eye, which Darwin said, sure, if anybody could prove that the eye evolved, then his theory was safe, something to that effect.
He said that he freely admits that the evolution of the eye sounds ridiculous, and then he gave like 2 paragraphs on how it happened.
But first of all, you have to wonder, how would sight even come about? It's just the concept of sight. You just stop to think about it. If you just sit in the darkness someday and just think about sight, it's amazing. It's like how did this come about? Through random changes. We start out with, but what is you got all these changes. It's like wishful thinking. You're going, well, this could happen, that we could have these adaptations and we're going to get these perfections. It's like we find things in nature that man copies. They're so wonderful that man copied, like flight. How did man decide that we could fly? Well, he watched birds go over. And you watch birds fly, and it is absolutely amazing. You watch the way that they flit in and out of obstacles and stuff like that, except sometimes they crash into your window. But mine are okay because they're dirty, so they can know that the windows are there. But
leading cause of death in birds.
But it's just amazing. So we have to copy nature in order to come up with some of our best inventions. So,
sure, but that's just because nature had more time to invent.
just your mutations. I mean, just things. So what if I got a gene mutation here and here and here? How does it go from this nothing to things that are amazing?
Well, so what I just explained with the evolution of the eye is that light is always there all the time. It's like sound. Sound's always there all the time anyway. We just use it as a resource.
Brain, it's got to be hooked up to the brain, or the eye isn't. It's just nothing. It's like the dysfunctional gene that you're talking about.
Right, but you understand there's different kinds of brains at different levels of complexity, right? I mean, so like you can have there are single-celled organisms, little protozoans that can detect light and shadow. They have photosensitive patches. They can detect light and shadows. They don't have a brain like us, certainly, but they have a rudimentary enough response to that shadow that they can tell that's probably a predator and they move. And so, like, is that as exciting to you as a human being being able to, see colors and read a book and everything like that? It's the exact same thing, just less of it. And we do a lot more of it. So again, like I was saying, you don't need the entire system exactly as it is today. You just need little stages, little changes over a little bit of time.
But still haven't answered my question, and I'm afraid you won't be able to.
What am I missing? Because I don't want to dodge any of your questions. So what exactly am I missing?
What is the process for making almost perfection out of basically nothing? I can if we have a random, an undirected mutations going on, you'd think things are just like the world would be devolving into chaos. So instead of
I'm fine with the word random for mutations.
You are okay. Some people get offended and say they're not random, they're non-directed.
Well, it's the way that we describe natural selection. It's the non-random selection of random mutations. So the mutation for sure is random, but the selection that happens after it is surely non-directed, but also isn't random. And that also, I think, answers your question. Is that random mutations? If that was all there was, then yes, everything would be chaos. But it just so happens that ecology is a thing, and it allows there's these different organisms all working together in the same ecosystem. And if one of them is dramatically out of place, they're going to die in a really weird way. And so if everything was random all the time with nothing constraining it, then yeah, sure, it would be chaos. The constraints are the fact that things need, resources to survive, and they need to be able to reproduce in order to pass on those changes. So if you get magically, this isn't how evolution works, but if somehow you had like 50,000 mutations all at once and it made you this super strong, amazing guy, and you're super tall and you look like Clint Eastwood, and you can bench press 500 pounds, and you're whatever amazing idea of perfection someone might have, but all you can't reproduce. It means nothing for evolution, because evolution only cares about reproduction. So, like, for example, salmon die immediately after they reproduce. It doesn't matter because they reproduced. The reason why we get, cancers and bad backs and lose our hair and our eyesight goes through senescence. The reason why we haven't evolved out of aging is because we hit sexual maturity in our late teens, early 20s at the latest. And that's historically when people had children. So you're already past reproductive age. So nothing else that happens at the end of that really matters, in terms of evolution anyway. So that I think that answers your question. If it didn't, please correct me. But like, the reason why you can get such majesty out of quote, quote, nothing, which I would argue it isn't nothing, is that those random changes are selected for by the environment the different organisms lived in. And if they had a deleterious mutation, they wouldn't be producing any offspring, or at least not enough offspring to compete with the better mutations out there. So the randomness becomes non-randomness. I can give another example if you like. One that has helped a few students of mine is that, like, if I had a pile of Lego bricks and some of them had the cap sawed off and some of them had the holes filled in, but some of them were good, I could grab Lego bricks at random and try to build a tower. The bad ones would fall off, the good ones would stick, and eventually I'd have a tower that looked pretty good, and it would look like order, but it was completely random process sticking them on there. Does that make sense?
Well, that analogy does. I'm not sure how it applies to what we're talking about, but
Well, that's the thing, is that the mutations are random. Me grabbing the Legos are random, but only certain ones are going to stick. And only the right one can only stick on that one, and the right one can only stick on that one. So it doesn't matter how random my grabbing is. It only matters what's happening in the real tower.
But you were a process there. You were grabbing those things and you were making things happen. There was an interference there. It wasn't that the wind came along and blew them together or something. You know, it's like the one man said, you know, the chances of life, you know, originating through natural causes is like a tornado going through a Boeing plant and assembling all the parts together into a plane.
Not
and
at
one
all.
that the windows don't blow out of.
Yeah, no, not at all. And that's the thing, is that like life, and this, we're getting off topic to the origin of life, which I'm very happy to do. But like, I just want to say, like, you know, the things that make life are pretty commonplace, and we've seen them self-assemble. And so like, that's a whole thing. If you want to get into that, I'm happy to. But like, when you talked about me, you know, being the mediator here by building things, in this analogy, that would be natural selection, is that all of these organisms live in the world. Natural selection isn't a mindful process. It's just the logical outcome of the fact that every living thing needs resources to survive. It needs to be able to compete with its contemporaries. It needs to be able to survive predation. Those are what we call selection pressures. So selection pressure basically boils down to, if you do this, you die. If you don't do that, you die. It's the ability to attain resources, the ability to survive predation, the random and non-random factors of your environment, an earthquake versus a leopard eating you, whatever it is. These are all selection pressures. So when you have, you know, this whatever model organism we're talking about here, if that random mutation that pops up is one that makes it slow to run, then it's going to get eaten by a tiger. And if it's one that makes it really, really good at extracting nutrients from food, then it needs less food to survive and thrive in the way that the other things around it need to eat more. And so it has a better advantage. So, you know, you're right. Me grabbing the Legos is a process, but it doesn't have to be a thoughtful, mindful, deliberate one. It's just the natural result of different types of things living in the same environment. And again, I want to ask you, like, what am I missing from your question? Have I addressed your question, or is there something that I'm still not hitting here?
Well, as I said, when we first started down this rabbit trail, I said, you will never be able to satisfactorily answer this question. Same way I could not prove to you that there's a God, you know.
Why are they different?
They're the belief in God and the belief in these organisms developing majestically through natural selection. I mean, first of all, you look and say, okay, I mean, DNA gets mutated. Yeah, once in a while there's mutations come along, but how often would these mutations be advantageous in the first place? And what would the chances be of these not only being advantageous, but leading to something being amazing, you know? And you make the statement, you said the origins have nothing to do with evolution. Well, I differ on that one, because if God created everything as it is today, the origin of life explains the diversity. Boom.
Mm-hmm. So what about the fact that we have seen the mutation selection mechanism in action, both in the lab and in the field? So like, for example, you know, we can put, I've done this myself in my undergrad, is you can put, you know, bacteria on a plate and that has increasingly more antibiotics, and you can watch as they grow up to the point where they can't survive anymore. And then there's a mutation, and they grow into the next area. And then there's another mutation, they grow into the next area. There's the Lenski long-term evolution experiment, where they've been doing this for decades now. And they've shown you can take the bacteria from 1970, whatever, that they've frozen, and the ones from 2020 that they've frozen, and they have completely different genomes, and they survive in different environments, and they do different things because they've just shown them evolving in the response to different pressures that they've put on them over time. So like, and there's also the lizards that we put out the coast of Croatia. They moved lizards from one island to the next, came back 40 years later. And this island, they were mainly eating insects over there. Over here, they had to eat vegetation. And their skulls had changed shape a little bit and their intestines had changed shape a little bit, and they were better adapted to eating vegetation, and genetic evidence showed that they were the same population. These were the descendants of those ones. So like there's laboratory and field experiments that show in short term, this is not changing into new animals, but it's showing that even in just a little bit of time, you can get major morphological changes based on new selection pressure and new mutations coming in, filling in the gaps. Does that not sound like exactly like what I'm talking about?
Okay, so you got bacteria changing, but they're still bacteria, and lizards changing, but they're still lizards. But in order to explain where we got from point zero to where we are today, I mean, you bring the story of the origin of the whale is, I think, the most outstanding example to me. It's the theory that some bear or wolf-like creature went off into the ocean and became a whale. That to me is like
it is a weird one. It's more like a fox deer kind of thing. Indo-Hyas, they're these weird little dudes. As a matter of fact, that's something that we're still learning quite a bit about today, because when we look over the fossil record of those things, isotope records show the transition between freshwater and saltwater. The fossil record shows the rostrum, the nasal aperture, moving back onto the head to be where it is today. We see the legs and diminishing and going down into flippers. We look at the bones of whales today and how they still have the same exact arm and hand bones as you and I have, just compressed. And so like these things, yeah, you're right. It sounds wild. It sounds absolutely astounding. And I love that shit because like it gets me excited because it sounds so wild. And then you look and you see the evidence for it. And it becomes not just a story, it's something that jumps off the page and you become able to actually interact with it. So like, I'd be happy to go over those things, but like, let's get to macroevolution here in a second. Just talking about microevolution, talking about species changing, like, are we on the same page with that's possible, or are we disagreeing on that too?
I'm fine with microevolution. I'm fine with.
Okay, so
things adapt.
Bacteria.
Adaptation.
Right. And that happens because of mutation. There's new mutations, random mutations, and then the best ones are selected for, and that's how we get those genetic changes in populations. That's how the bacteria and the lizards were able to adapt to their new environments. Are we in agreement on that?
Okay, so to answer this question for me,
first, are we in agreement on that, or are we not?
Yeah, okay.
We are? Okay, excellent. Now, please ask whatever you like.
Revolution exists. So, but in the wintertime, it gets cold out.
Yes.
I go outside and I go walking. I'm freezing my butt off at 40 degrees or something like that to start with. As the winter gets colder, I get more and more comfortable being in colder temperatures. I'm acclimating. I'm adapting, but do I have genetic changes going on in my body?
No. So this is another super common sticking point for people, is that there's a difference between acclimatization, adaptation, and evolution. So acclimatization is what you're talking about. It can be short-term, a few months or less, sometimes even just a few seconds. It's just changing your body, the physiological response to the environment around you. Say you go for a run and you have increased metabolic demand, your blood vessels dilate, your heart beats faster, you're sweating, blah, blah, blah. This is acclimatization, getting used to the wintertime, not being so cold from one day to the next. That's acclimatization. Evolution, as we talked about earlier, is a change in the heritable characteristics of an entire population of organisms over the course of several generations, which could be anywhere between a few minutes to a few decades. So depending on the species. In the middle, you have adaptation, which is this really sticky, tricky word, because adaptation can be used to describe a change or the process of the change or any individual characteristic of an animal, or of an organism. So like if I talk about a polar bear has black skin to help it absorb a little extra heat from the sun and stay a little bit warmer, I can call the black skin itself an adaptation. I can call the process of it developing the black skin over several generations adaptation. I can call all these things. These are all just a fun way to use this word, and it freaking sucks, and it makes it really difficult to teach. And I hate it. It's like the common use of the word theory when people say theory just means guess, because that's the way we use it commonly, and that's not what it means in science. So when you're talking about there, that's acclimatization, that's acclimation, that's not actually evolutionary change.
Right.
Where is that going for you?
I just wondered how you would explain that. So
yeah,
I wondered
it's
if there
just
was something I didn't know
changes.
about. Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah, that all has to do with one of the, here's a crazy secret about biology, is that we don't know what the hell life is. We don't have a definition for the word life. We just have characteristics for what life does. And one of the 7 qualifications for calling something alive is homeostasis, is being able to maintain a stable internal environment as opposed to the external environment. And so that's a lot of people use the word adaptation for that. A lot of people use the word, different things, but it's not really to do with evolution. Although the ability to do that is an evolved trait, which is weird. it's kind of frustrating to discuss. Yeah. Do you have any other, before we move on to anything else, because I want to get to macroevolution with you, and I'd love to talk about the origin of life with you as well. Is there anything else right here that you feel like I haven't properly addressed?
No, I think we're good.
Okay. Let me ask you one more question before we move on. There was one thing that really stuck out to me, is that you said a minute ago, that you don't think I'd be able to adequately answer whatever questions it is. And I feel like I've covered everything. To your satisfaction is what the key.
I just can't fathom how, you can go from 0 to 1 million or something like that with just these chance and random mutations. Sure. I mean, I can see where things could change, but to change the way they would have to in order to go from a one-celled creature in the beginning to having, I don't know how many species of creatures do we find on the earth today? I mean, just in millions. The insect world. I mean, yes. And most of them come to my house. It's like, but
I forgot who said it, but somebody was saying if there is a God, he must be very fond of beetles, because we have so many beetles. I forgot who said that. Someone's going to correct me in the comment section and call me stupid. But so that's the thing. I want to make sure before we move any further, we're going to get there, and I think we can come to some common ground on it. But when you said to your satisfaction, it just jumped out to me, because very often, we'll have these discussions with people, and they make it clear you're not going to change my mind. And I want to make sure that that's not where we're at right now. Are you open to changing your mind at all on this? Or do you think you're just locked down, this can't be true, and you're not going to agree?
I doubt that you could provide anything that's sufficient to change my mind. And I would use the analogy of this. You have a junior high football team, and so you say, okay, we're going to get a new coach in here. We're going to really train these kids. They're going to be excellent. We're going to go win the Super Bowl next year. We can beat all these teams in the NFL. If that actually happened, how do you explain that process? I mean, it's crazy to think that this can happen. And then that's something that's purposed. I mean, the thing with mutations is, they have no consciousness. They don't know what they're aiming for. We have, I decide when I grow up, I say, I want to be a teacher, or I want to be an astronaut or something. We have goals that we set. You say, how do I get from my goal to my goal from where I am today? We have a plan and so on. And and it's difficult for us to do that, to achieve those dreams. And you take these creatures, that doesn't have an eye, and you take our muscles, for example. So what if you got muscles came along, got created? If they aren't balanced, you got opposing muscles. If they don't work the same, if they're not, you don't have the triceps and the biceps to offset each other. There's so many complexities in the body. It's just amazing. The foot is probably the least interesting part of our body, but Leonardo da Vinci thought it was an absolute masterpiece. So that's
it is wild.
Trying to explain how that all happened. I want to see a step A, step B, step C, step C, and you're just saying, okay, this is a process. It happened because we're here, and so this had to happen to get here. And my counter argument is, it didn't. It's not a process. It happened right off the beginning. God created an animal to have, a heart and a liver and so on. They still exist the way he created them. Although there's, been some adaptations, like, the one that's interesting is the dog world. Was there one set of wolves or something like that, and they all became Pekingese and Chihuahuas, and I find that kind of unbelievable. It's like, how do you evolve from a wolf to a Chihuahua?
Well, I think that's a great example. So like we that's artificial selection. So like, for example, you take broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cauliflower, kale, and kohlrabi. All of these vegetables are the exact same species of wild mustard plant that we have been breeding selectively for hundreds of years, bringing out different traits. The same way with dogs. We've been breeding them. We wanted a dog that could fit down foxholes and chase things out. And so we bred the shortest, longest dogs until we got a dog. Exactly. Yeah. And so like, that's something that we can see with our own eyes. When we look at every single, you go to the grocery store, every single plant or animal matter that you can buy in there is something that we have deliberately changed through artificial breeding. There are artificial selection, selective breeding, only bringing out the traits that we want. So like, you look at a wild apple or a wild peach, and they're these tiny, bitter, horrible things. And then the ones that we've made, these massive, gargantuan, delicious things, because we selected for size and taste, which aren't beneficial in the wild the same way. So like, that's the exact same thing, is that like, there was in the wolf population, there wasn't any genes to make a wiener dog. But by selecting for them and by random mutation, we picked the random one that we liked the most, and we only bred those ones by the non-random selection of random changes. We were able to make all these different dog breeds, all these different plant breeds. That's the exact same thing that we're talking about with natural selection. We're just talking about a non-guided process doing it. And so in one case with artificial selection, which you and I seem to agree is a thing, with artificial selection, it's a human being coming along and saying, okay, I want it to look like this now, and this is my goal, this is my plan. With natural selection, instead of a person deciding, it's just, does it survive or not? And it's the whole environment around it, all the living and non-living things around it, deciding whether or not it's able to reproduce. So what's the disconnect there? If we can agree, it sounds like we agree on artificial selection. And if we can, then what's the disconnect between that being reasonable and natural selection being reasonable?
Well, you're going to take an apple and create a giraffe out of it through some mutation?
We're still talking about the same species, right? We haven't gotten to macroevolution yet. We're still talking about the same species, though.
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah, definitely. I mean, they've been doing hybridization for a long time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you agreed with me earlier on that, like, the mutation selection mechanism leading to microevolution changes within the same species. You agreed that made sense. You agreed with me earlier that random mutations can form order and can make things that make sense, that are able to live, and that new alleles can come about. You agreed with me earlier that the alleles are going to be selected for their environment. So like, we're right up there to the edge of macroevolution. And it sounds like now you're also agreeing with artificial selection and how natural selection can work the same way. It sounds like we're in agreement so far on everything leading up to changes between different types of animals or different types of organisms. Am I misrepresenting you in any way so far?
Well, it might be strong to say we agree. I will quit resisting any further, but
if I've said anything that you don't think makes sense, I want to tackle it.
Well, I mean, it's like I said, you're never going to convince me.
Well, that bothers me, because like, you could convince me that I'm wrong. You could convince me. I'm open to new ideas, but if you're gonna tell me like, hey, it doesn't matter what you say, I'm not going to believe you anyway, then like, what's the point in anything? Like, what's the point in learning it? If you've decided what you want to know, then why do you want to explore anything new? Like, does it matter to you whether or not what you believe is true?
Well, absolutely.
So then
you also have to
I should be able to convince you.
You have to examine and say, well, what is the outcome of the truth?
Does it matter if it's the truth? I would rather know the truth and be happy with it. So, like, if you're going to tell me that there's nothing I can say to convince you, if I'm right, I should be able to convince you, right?
Well,
doesn't
you're
that
right.
Yeah.
So, conversely, then, if I'm right and God does exist, then you should be willing to accept that.
Yes, absolutely. If God is real, I want to know, and if evolution isn't real, I want to know, and I would be more than happy to change my mind. But
see,
like,
the thing is,
I haven't been.
What do you gain? What do you gain by embracing evolution and not embracing God?
What do I gain by embracing evolution and not embracing God? Is that what you asked?
Right.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Yes.
I gain the truth. As far as I know, from what I've understood. So as far as I know, from what I understand about the world, from the evidence I've gotten, evolution is real and God is not. Or rather, I shouldn't say God is not real. That's wrong to say. I don't have a reason to believe in a God. I do have a reason to believe in evolution, so I'm following what I have a reason to believe. And that's the same thing for absolutely everything. The only reason I believe in plate tectonics, the only reason I believe the Earth goes around the sun, the only reason I believe in anything at all is because of the evidence leading up to it. So when you say, I don't have anything specifically to gain being an atheist, I'm not like, going out here trying to win the prize. It's just that hasn't convinced me. But evolution absolutely has. And I've got more than enough evidence and reason to believe it. And I've done experiments on it myself. I've done research that involves it. It is the central theory of biology. It's the glue that holds all of biology together.
Oh, no, you're not going to pull that card, are you?
I absolutely am. Nothing in biology makes sense without evolution. So it's not like if you could prove it wrong, amazing. We have so much more work to do. We have to go back and reevaluate everything. But as I said earlier on, these two questions are disjointed. So even if you could prove evolution wrong, it would mean that we have a lot of shit to figure out in biology, but it doesn't say anything about a God to me. That's a totally different question. And so, just to be clear, if I could, I'm sorry, I know I rambled for a long time, but if I could just throw this in there, like, it's important to also point out that happening where like the fundamental core of biology fell apart and we had to start from scratch, that's happened several times. The evolution being a thing completely changed what we thought we knew about biology. Fossils completely changed what we thought we knew about biology. Microorganisms completely changed what we thought we knew about biology. The history of biology is this is how we know everything works, and then we discover a new thing and everything falls apart and we have to build it back up from the ground up. So like, I would be fine with that if there was a reason to believe that's the case, and there just isn't. So that's I want to say that so that nobody listening, I know for sure I could hear the comment section in my head where someone's going to say, see, he only believes it because it would destroy his worldview. No, my worldview, as I said earlier, is about trying to prove myself wrong and only moving forward when I can't anymore. I can't prove evolution wrong. The evidence is too overwhelming. If something comes along that changes it, it's going to be a huge deal. Now, please, I'm sorry. I know I talked for a very long time. I'm sure you have something to tell me.
I might wonder how much research you put into finding God and proving that that you were wrong in the assumption that he didn't exist and that he doesn't love you and doesn't want you to live with him for eternity.
Yeah. So two things I think are important here. Number one, I mentioned earlier when you talked about heaven, like that it was just not something that I was interested in at all. We can go into this if you'd like. It's not really necessary for this video, but like what you just described, just God that loves me and wants me to live with him for eternity, that sounds awful to me. That is actually a deeply hurtful idea. And so like, but that's neither here nor there. I live in Oklahoma. There's double-digit churches within walking distance of my house. I find crosses or not just crosses. I don't want to pick on Christianity. I find these religious symbols that are all around me and these ideas deeply troubling and offensive. I don't like it at all. It's not for me. But that's neither here nor there. At the end of the day, as I said before, if you could provide sufficient evidence for a God, I'd believe in it. I would still be deeply against it, but I would believe it's real. I just wouldn't like him very much. But that still has nothing to do with evolution.
You'd be like a smoker then that would believe that tobacco was going to give him lung cancer and tuberculosis.
But chooses to
and
smoke anyway, yeah.
But kept right on chain smoking. that's
for lack of a better analogy, sure. It's just I don't like the idea of the gods on offer. I don't like how they're described. I don't like the implications of what they are. I don't like the logical conclusions of them. But again, that's not really the point of this. I do whole atheist call-in shows about that. And I'm happy to talk to you about it if you'd like later on. But like for right now, what I'm trying to draw attention to is just the fact that like, even if you could prove that there's a God, okay, then now I know that, but I still have all the reason to believe in evolution. It's not one or the other. So the best you could do is tell me that this God deliberately made evolution happen in the way that I see it. To convince me that evolution isn't real would have nothing to do with whether or not a God is real. It's not either or. You know what I mean?
All righty, let's move on.
Okay, I just want to be clear that it's if you want to talk to me about God, I'm into it. I do it for a living. But like I promise you're not going to change my mind about evolution if you could prove God to me, because they're different questions. So we talked about getting to this point. We've talked about everything up to macroevolution. I would like to extend the same logical process that we've gone through so far, where you were saying that like you're willing to. You said agree was a strong word, which I'd like to get back to, but you were willing to say, okay, maybe this, and this. We said at the very beginning, or at least I did, I don't know if you agree with me, that like the only difference between the two things is DNA. So say keratin. Keratin is the chemical that makes your hair and your fingernails, and also it makes your skin waterproof. It makes bird feathers. It makes scales. It makes all of these things. It's the same exact chemical, just in different arrangements. Same way carbon makes the graphite in a pencil and a diamond. It's the same carbon, just in different arrangements, right? So we talk about, birds. Birds evolved from dinosaurs, which means at some point or another, these lizards grew feathers and also warm blood and also wings and also, all these different things. Well, it just so happens this is the exact same chemical that makes the scales and the feathers. So a small mutation to a dinosaur's scales causes those scales to develop as feathers, the same way that we can see now today chickens and pigeons that are selectively bred through artificial selection by humans to grow feathers on their feet where they would normally have scales. Same exact kind of mutation. That's changing this lizard into a bird, changing from scales to feathers, changing cold blood to warm blood, whatever else you want to go, but they would have slightly different heart muscles and slightly different muscle tissues and things like this. When we talk about changing one kind of thing to another, all we're talking about is an accumulation of small changes. So if I could prove to you that I could walk 5 feet, and then someday later on you found that I had walked 10 miles, you don't have to wonder if there was a different process. Maybe by magic he was propelled. I just did the 5 feet thing over and over. So if we can agree that small random mutations can become non-random ordered selection that causes new bodies, new phenotypes, where's the disconnect for you between that and then saying also we can get a totally new species, or a totally new, I should say, a new type of organism?
Well, first of all, your analogy, I think, doesn't do the trick. Do your 5 steps. I mean, your next 5 steps are all steps. I mean, it's one foot in front of the other. There's no change. It's one step. There was no change towards perfection, towards something new. It was the same thing over and over again. There was no mutation there, except that you took a movement one way. It wasn't changed.
Maybe I wasn't clear. In my analogy, I mean the steps to be the changes. Yeah. So I mean the steps to be mutations. So if I can show I can walk a little bit, and then you see I've walked a lot, you can assume I did the little bit thing over and over. So if we can show that a little random mutation can cause microevolution, then what's the disconnect in saying lots of microevolutionary changes can build up to be a macroevolutionary change?
Well, first of all, if that happened, if that happened, there would be a multitude of fossils left behind that would show the transitions, and that's not seems to be the case. We've been talking about
very much is.
Well, that's where I guess the problem with anything dealing with science here is that we have to examine where we get our information.
Mm.
None of us, I don't care who you are, you don't have that knowledge firsthand. There are
Right.
scientists that work on this specific aspect of science, and then someone else that works on somewhere else. You got the astrophysics, you got all these different disciplines. They maybe did a portion of the research themselves for their knowledge. The rest of it came from someone else. They listened to
Yeah,
someone, they read someone, and they
it's
accepted that
compounding
information
knowledge.
as
Yeah.
being correct. Right. So the premise, if it's based upon false information, is giving them a false foundation. And so if you keep on building on that foundation, you just get further in error as you go along.
Well, sometimes, yes, that has happened. But the whole point is to be able to go back and repeat experiments and recheck things. And indeed, there's a lot of times in science where we go back and we find that there's either missing information before, or as we get further down the line, things are making a little bit less sense. And we go back here and we check and we fix it. There's a million examples of that happening. Like I said, the point of science is to be able to self-correct. That doesn't mean we get it right all the time. I could give you books of times that scientists have gotten things wrong, but that's the point, is to try to build our knowledge ahead, little by little. The same way that when you worked on computers, I'm sure you weren't going back and reinventing the motherboard and, doing what Steve Jobs and everybody did.
Yeah.
You're building on the knowledge that you already had and making new things.
Well, absolutely. In fact, as a programmer, you use a high-level language, which someone else has written, a language that translates what you've written, so you can write stuff in English. So,
Exactly.
I mean, it's like, if you took the knowledge, you took everybody who knew plumbing and just had them disappear off the earth, our society would be in a world of hurt, because
Yeah.
it would take people in order to develop the plumbing systems all over again. It would take a tremendous amount of experimentation, learning at some.
Right.
But the thing is, we would know as people. We used to have this thing called plumbing. How do we do that? Whereas with
but like
organisms, they don't even have a knowledge. Yeah, that there's no knowledge in the animal world saying, well, we don't have the power to fly. What do we need to do to fly? Like I use the example of, this bird, this dinosaur. He's sitting there, gosh, I wish I could fly. And so he develops the wings, which the wings are amazing too. The complexity of the wings and the strength of them and so on. And so even if he developed these wings, how did he learn to fly in the first place? I mean, it's just because, our brain, we say we use about 10% of the capacity of our brains. Well, how do we tap into the other 90%?
Yeah, that's not true at all. But like the whole thing is, I think your analogy was spot on when you talk about plumbers. If plumbers disappeared, our society would be in trouble. But the science of fluid dynamics that allows plumbing to work, and about pressure and all these things, that's all objective. The only difference is we discovered it, we learned it, we wrote it down, we learned how to make use of it. So the physics were always there. We learned to use that as a resource for our purposes. So if all the plumbers disappeared, it would take some time, but eventually we would rediscover the exact same thing, because the physics are objective. So when you talk about now with a wing, like fluid mechanics in the air are also objective. So gliding is a lot easier than flying, and flying is just gliding with some flapping involved. And like same thing with the eye, same thing with the ear, same thing with any other thing complex structure you want to talk about. There are stages building up to it, every stage of which is useful. So it's not like something was walking around with one wing hanging off one side and the other side was just an arm and it didn't know what to do until it evolved another wing. Like every stage leading up to flight is a useful adaptation for that organism. And eventually we get to something that looks at the surface level very complex, but is in fact just a buildup of lots of very non-complex things all working together. Like you said, the heart and the brain and the lungs and the eye, all of these are complex things made of simple things. And when you put them all together, it sounds even more complex. But it isn't like something's just sitting there with a heart waiting for a brain to tell it to pump. So when we talk about this stuff, you mentioned we don't have the firsthand experience. That's everything. That if I'm judging a murder trial, I don't have to watch the guy murder the same person 3 times so I have a testable, observable experiment. I can use the evidence that's there to put together the story. And it's the same thing with this. If I know the mechanisms by which evolution is possible, and I see different fossils at different layers of strata at different times that all sync up in a line, and even if I'm missing a couple in the middle, I can still see that these organisms are different than those organisms, and I know that there is a process that I can test and see organisms are able to change. How can I not just put that evidence together and say, okay, so here's the story. Here's what it all looks like. And later on, I'll come along and I'll refine little bits of that story and learn more and more and put in new puzzle pieces. How can I not do that? Like, where's the difference for between you and me, where you and I agreed, and I go, again, agree is a strong word, but a minute ago, we were on the same page that mutations happen, natural selection happens, artificial selection can create huge variety and diversity among the same species, and natural selection can almost certainly do the same thing, and we know that walking 5 feet enough times will get you a mile, so we can say that small mutations over a long period of time can create a big change, just like differences in dogs, just like differences in mustard. Where's that disconnect where now you're saying, yeah, but you didn't see it happen, and this is all knowledge from somebody else, and you know, it sounds too fantastic. Like, how does that circle get squared for you?
Well, while I've got it in my mind here, let me go back to the analogy you just used. You're on the jury of a murder trial, and you've looked at the evidence, and you've pronounced for guilty or not guilty. But the evidence is based upon test witnesses. How do you know they're telling the truth?
So
that's a judgment you made. You made a value judgment based upon your own, perspective and your own biases, perhaps. He said, "I don't like that guy. He must be telling, a lie," something like that. It's objective. And so, what if you've taken evidence concerning science from somebody who was lying, or was just
the difference
mistaken?
Is that in science we have to show our work. And like I said, there have been plenty of times where somebody has gotten something wrong and we've run with it for a bit longer than we should have. There's a million stories like that in science. But at this point, when we talk about evolution, this is something that, when I say it's the central theory of biology, I don't just mean that to say like we have to believe in it. I mean that to say every single thing that we do in biology points back in that direction. And so, like, it wouldn't just be the case of like somebody found this fossil, like, you look at like a duck-billed platypus. When they first brought that thing and they're like, look at this is a thing, everybody thought they were lying. They were like, you clearly sewed like 3 animals together, you monster, what's wrong with you? And then it turned out that was actually a thing. And so it didn't matter what you thought of this person, the evidence actually was there. Same thing with fossils. There was the understanding of what a fossil was in the beginning was a revolutionary idea. It was it completely shook the fundamental core of biology down to the foundations. And it didn't matter who was saying it, because at the end of the day, the evidence was overwhelming by itself. So when you talk about this, it's not like I just read some book by some famous evolutionary biologist and was like, well, this guy said it, so it must be true. These are things that we actually test in a lab, that we show to be real, that we see in the world all around us. And several lines of evidence from several different fields all point back to the same thing. And it continues to show itself to be, despite so many chances to be wrong, it always comes back as right. So it's not the same at all as saying that, like, well, this person said it, so I believe it. Like, this is actually something that the evidence is clear on the ground and anybody can assess it and come to the same conclusion.
So what do you do with Piltdown Man or Nebraska Man?
Yeah. So like I said, there's plenty of times where we got shit wrong. So Nebraska Man wasn't as big of a deal as people like to pretend, but Piltdown Man certainly was. Some dude, we still don't know exactly who, took an orangutan jaw and a particularly thick human skull cap, soaked them in some dark chemicals to make them dark, and threw them in a ditch that was being dug. And then somebody came along the next day and said, look, I found this thing. And what that teaches us is actually exactly the thing that I'm talking about. is that when this came out, and when all these anthropologists who are, these, European dudes all coming out and they're like, look, we found the missing link and all this stuff, all the dentists of the world came out and said, you're wrong. These are very clearly not human teeth, and they're filed down. This is not a natural wear pattern. This doesn't make any sense. And all of the anthropologists were like, shut up, dentists. You don't know what you're talking about. And like, there were lots of other scientists that were in there saying, this is BS. This doesn't make any sense at all. And it was also a history of racism, because these are these people, these white Englishmen who were saying, yes, the history of humankind was African ape, white Englishman, and then humans, and that's the only way it could work. And it was, really quick. It was a huge news, and then very quickly we realized it was wrong, and we said, never mind. Nebraska man I believe was a farmer, found a tooth and sent it to his friend who was a paleontologist and said, that kind of looks like a human, and it was all over the newspapers. But the scientific journals from the time were all saying, this doesn't make sense. This is not a human tooth. This is very clearly not real. And then sure enough, it was a pig tooth at the end. So it was big in the press. The same thing with Piltdown Man. It was very big in the press, but it certainly wasn't, the scientific community sorted it out really quick. And as a matter of fact, I've got down here my undergrad bioanthro textbook. Bioanthropology is the study of humans and as an animal, human evolution and everything. That's what my first master's was in. And like, we have a whole chapter in here on Piltdown Man and what it taught us, and how it's so easy for people to say bullshit and then run with it, and why scientific rigor is important, and why it's important to check your evidence. That's why scientific papers today are, 20, 30 pages if you're lucky. And back in the day, it was a little half a page of like, I found this, it's pretty neat. And everybody went, and then we moved on. So yeah, it's not, again, I can't stress enough, it's not just something somebody said. It's something that we actually have tremendous amounts of evidence for. And even the stuff that sounds fantastic has concrete, solid evidence. Otherwise, we wouldn't accept it. I feel like you have something else, and I want to hear it.
I just have difficulty understanding how you can apply the scientific method to macro evolution, but we haven't got there yet.
No, let's get there now. We've been putting it off for 20 minutes. Right. So how do you? Yep. What's the issue with that?
Well, science, to me, my definition of science is man uncovering the world that God has created for us. So I see in the world, so what we have going on in our world today is we have pharma companies creating medicines that they, have created in the laboratory that they sell to us at exorbitant costs to try to keep us alive so that we can keep buying their medicines, where we have natural medicines in our world, things that God created for us is just like a whole apothecary out there in the world, that we've got things that people used to use in the old days before big pharma came along. And, that's we've got what I call political science now. We got people saying here, if you don't accept our medicines here or something like that, you're a science denier and so on like that. And my argument is, wait a second. Let's use real science here. You got it. The scientific method is involved. It's necessary for real science to happen. That's what the definition of doing science is, by using the scientific method. You say, what's the temperature that water boils? Well, let's find out. Put a pot on the stove, boil it. Oh, okay. It's okay. It boils at 212. Oh, wait a second. What if we put this pot on a mountaintop? Is it still 212? Right. No, it's not. Atmospheric pressure. Mm-hmm. Yeah, laws are complex.
I agree with you. There's certain things there that maybe you and I will disagree on, but like I agree that like when politics gets mixed into science, it sucks and it's a bad time. And there's a lot of issues today that I'm sure you and I are gonna talk about, disagree on, or whatever like that, where it's become more of a political issue than a scientific one. But at the end of the day, science is still take the God thing out of it, and I agree with you. Nature is what nature is. Our job as scientists is to look at nature and draw little boxes around things and name them and label them and try to figure out what nature is. But at the end of the day, nature is what nature is, and our little boxes aren't real. And that's why, the common analogy I give is a map. The Earth is what the Earth looks like. Every map is wrong, but some of them are useful. And so because the Earth is the Earth and the map is a projection. And we say the same thing in science. There's actually a phrase that we teach everybody from the very first class. All models, all theories are wrong. Some of them are useful. Reality is what reality is. We're just trying to identify it and define it. So where does that issue arise then with macroevolution? If we're doing the same thing where we look at a species, there's no such thing as a species. We just draw a little box around one kind of thing and say, these are all similar enough, we're going to call them a thing. And that's just our definition. What's the difference between that and anything else? Where's the disconnect between that and macroevolution? Why is it an issue for that and not for anything else?
I want to see it in like I'm not from Missouri, but show me, I want to see, and you'd say, well, it takes thousands of generations, thousands of years in order to see that happen, to change one species into another species. I want to, get me in the laboratory and let me see this stuff. It's like the guy who tried to create life in a laboratory. He says, well, we need these compounds and stuff when we'll introduce the heat and whatever that would, be the same as lightning or something like that, and would cause life to happen. I can't remember what his name was, but you probably know it.
You're probably talking about the Urey Miller experiment. That's a famous one.
Yeah, that's the guy. And he couldn't do it. I mean, we like you said before, though, we don't even know what life is. It's like something's either alive or it's dead. There's no in between. Is live or dead? Why am I dead?
There are kind of in-betweens, like viruses. They're not technically alive, but they don't seem to give a damn what we think, And so that's the thing, is that reality is what reality is, and all we're doing is trying to identify things and draw boxes around it. And even life itself is just something that we're observing as a phenomenon, and we're trying to understand it better. But it is what it is, and us as scientists are just trying to figure it out, and our definitions are imperfect, and that's necessarily part of the thing. But like, you're talking about show me macroevolution happening. I would take you back to the murder trial. If you see this guy, if you have a video of the guy going into the house before the murder, coming out after the murder, you have fingerprints on the gun, you have footprints in the snow, you have all the written motive, whatever it is, do you have to see him kill the guy? Or can you just say, I have a process by which it happened. I have little snapshots, snippets of time that show the time leading up to it and the time going away from it. I can put these pieces together and paint a picture that looks awful lot like this guy murdered him. And until something comes along that proves that wrong, I'm going to move ahead with this picture that I've created with the evidence that I have. It's the same thing with this. We have a process by which evolution can work, that we know works, that we can see in a laboratory, that we can see in a field. We know it works. We just see a little bit of it. And we see snapshots in the fossil record, changes over time, lots of transitional things. We see adaptation in real time sometimes. We have laboratory experiments. We have field observations. We have homology. We have embryology. We have all these different things that all point in the same direction. I don't have to watch Endohyus walk into the water and turn into a whale over 30 million years. I have all these snapshots that I can put together and say, this is what this looks like. And until something better comes along that proves me wrong, this is what I'm going to go ahead with. What's the difference between our what we're talking about?
Well, your murder trial analogy is not going to fly either, because the guy, it's just a simple fact. The lady's dead, or the victim is dead. This guy had access, he had a weapon, whatever. It's very, very, very simplistic. We would need to have the analogy comparable. It would have to be something absolutely phantasmagorical that happened to cause the death that you couldn't explain how the guy did it.
Well, I don't think so, because it isn't really that different at all. Because I understand you can poke holes in any analogy, but like the difference isn't, is it fantastic or not? I can say, anything I want about this story. I can say, listen, no, it's actually aliens. Aliens came down and murdered this person and planted all the evidence. That's I guess technically not impossible, but I need a reason to believe that more than the reason to believe the simple thing. It's like old Occam's razor. If you hear hoofbeats, think horses before you think zebras. So evolution isn't really that fantastic. We see the steps of it happening in small scale, and all I'm saying is a lot of small scale things are going to make a big scale thing. A lot of bricks make a house. And if you say, oh, where'd this house come from? And I say, well, look at a brick. And you say, that's just a brick. Yeah, but you get enough bricks together, you get a damn house. And so it's the same thing that I'm saying here. Is that, like, we know the small scale changes.
The bricks have to be assembled intelligently, or
I'm just giving,
worthless.
Yeah, it's a shitty analogy, I get, but like I'm just saying, like that's the connection I'm trying to draw here. Is that, like, we have these basic steps, and we see the big picture, and we see connections between the little steps and the big picture. Why isn't that good enough for you there?
I just can't add 1 and 6 together and get a million. So analogy that I use is that you have Michael Jordan standing here with his Air Jordans on, and he jumps 42 inches or something like that, and you go, wow. And then you find his Air Jordans on the moon. You say, oh my God, he jumped all the way to the moon. He left his shoes there, and when he came back, it's like, how else can you explain it? I mean, you saw him, and here's his shoes now. How else did he get to the moon? Unless he jumped there. I mean, it's like, this is crazy talk. It's absolutely impossible to happen. So to me, for a protozoa to end up being a human being who has a brain capable of carrying on discussion about this happening defies belief. It's just too fantastic.
But this is where I was talking about at the very beginning, is that, like, one of the first questions I asked you was, are you familiar with other mechanisms of evolution? And you said you weren't, and that's fine. Nobody, I went to school to become a biologist on purpose. I don't recommend anybody else. It's insane. But, like, you don't have to know this stuff, but just knowing that they exist is really important. So, like, you're right. Again, saying, he must have jumped to the moon because the only mechanism I know of for getting Air Jordans up in the air is jumping. So therefore that sounds wild. But if you know rocket ships exist, then you can factor that evidence in and say, okay, well, maybe this is something that goes in the middle here that I'm missing. And so when we talk about, huge changes in evolution, the mutation selection neo-Darwinian evolution model, that's one thing. Natural selection is one mechanism. There's also sexual selection. There's also gene flow. There's also genetic drift. There's all these other things. There's epigenetics. There's neo-Lamarckian evolution. There's all these other factors that play into it that can cause rapid changes over a relatively short amount of time. And indeed, when we look at the fossil record, we see a system, what we call punctuated equilibrium, where we'll see a mass extinction event. So now all of a sudden there's all these new niches, all these new environments that are open and ready to be exploited. And life rapidly diversifies and changes in this short time because it doesn't have as much competition, and it's able to change very dramatically. And then it kind of stabilizes as all these things fill in. We're able to see rapid change in the fossil record. We're able to see, what a lot of creationists like to call transitional forms in the fossil record. And even without the fossil record, we have genetics, which show the same homologies, the same linkages. And we're able to build whole family trees just based on genetic differences between individual humans or indeed whole taxa, whole groups of species. So I understand what you're talking about here, but I think you're missing this critical step of, like, looking at everything in the big picture. You're looking at this really oversimplified, dumbed down version of evolution and saying this doesn't make any sense. And I agree it doesn't. But there's plenty of other theories, germ theory, plate tectonics, cell theory, that you could very easily argue we've never looked at every single possible organism under a microscope to see that it's made of cells. We've never tested every single disease in history to make sure that it came from germs. We've never watched the plates move over the Earth's surface over billions of years. No one's ever seen that happen. You just have earthquakes, and earthquakes could be giants shaking the earth from below. Who knows? I don't see why you would accept all these other theories that have at least as much evidence, if not a little bit less, than evolution does. But when it comes to evolution, you say, well, I'm missing these gaps, therefore it can't be real.
Oh, I mentioned the chicken and the egg example.
Sure.
One of the things that's really a stumbling block for me is the development of reproductive organs.
Mm-hmm.
You got a male and a female human being or animal. I mean, there are reproductive parts that had to be necessary for that to happen.
Sure.
How does, I mean, if you can't reproduce till you get these, how do you gradually get reproductive organs when you can't pass on to progeny unless you have those reproductive organs in the first place? And you have to have the male and the female both develop at the same time in order to. It's
Donald, this is the exact same thing. But Donald, this is the exact same thing that we've talked about this whole time, is that like you're looking at things as they are right now and assuming that if they're not exactly the way that they are right now, then they can't exist. When in reality, it's very easy to see a gradient. You talk about, you look at start at an arbitrary point, fish and amphibians lay their eggs in the water, and then you get lizards laying them on land. Well, how did that happen? Well, you need an amniotic egg that has a shell around the outside of it. So you just you have a little mutation, make it have a hard shell so it doesn't dehydrate. Talk about, there are different kinds of reptiles. There are some that do, they're oviparous, that lay eggs outside their body. There are some that are viviparous, that give birth to live young. And there are some in the middle that are oviviviparous, that have this kind of weird middle ground thing with like egg sacs in their body, and then they're young or live when they come out. And you move on to a mammal, which there's a whole mountain. I could talk for 45 minutes about how live birth of mammals came about. But like, you then look at the next step just to simplify it and say, okay, well, I know that there's these reptiles that can give live birth, and I know mammals can too. And it's not like any one of them is missing a reproductive organ. I just kept the eggs internalized, and I kept the sperm internalized, and I have a transmitter or something like that. You look at, if you're talking about the evolution of sex organs in us, you can look at the whole history of penises across the primate order and see all these variety differences leading up to us. Do you know we're the only primates that don't have a penis bone? How wild is that? And you can look at how this thing degraded over time. And so like, it's the exact same thing as pick your favorite, any other organ, any other process, where if you look across the animal kingdom today, you see different stages that are functional and useful for the organisms that have them. And when you look at the fossil record, you see the same kind of gradient. Go back 220 million years to the origin of mammals, and you see things like Eomea, which was one of the first placental mammals to ever exist. 220 million years is the origin of mammals as a whole. Eomea would have been 120 million years ago. Pardon me, I got my timelines mixed up. So you see 220 million years ago, we're all monotremes. Like you have a platypus and echidna today are mammals that lay eggs still. And then you go 120 million years ago, you see Eomea, who has a placenta. And then you see the diversification there. But placental's one way, marsupial's the other way, where you have this, you give birth to some barely formed thing that has to live in a pouch. And then you have monotremes going another way. And so you see this point of diversification where the ability to have children and the mechanism by which they have children changes and becomes more interesting. And you could apply that same tree to limbs, fingers, flight, eyes, you name it. You see a line, one type of thing, and then diversification, a new thing comes along. And sometimes they live contemporaneously. Sometimes one breaks off and dies off and it's only one left. Sometimes they break off and they fuse back together later. Life diversifies like a tangled bush, not quite like a tree. Where's the disconnect here just to pick, well, you can't do it with an eye. Yes, we can. Well, you can't do it with sex organs. Yes, we can. Well, you can't do it with the heart. Yes, we can. At what point is it enough?
Well, you're saying that you can. I'm not, that's what the disconnect is I'm not accepting that it can. I'm not accepting
what am I
that
missing?
Sex organs. Well, it's just that without reproductive organs, if you can't reproduce, then you can't have mutations being passed on to progeny because there is no such thing as progeny. Because progeny are the product
can
of
sex
reproduction.
Can sex organs also change? couldn't sex organs be subject to the same kind of mutations?
But how do you, I mean, what precipitated reproduction in the very beginning? I mean, so
Why did
life
sex
got
evolve in the
created.
beginning?
So somehow this goo came along and became chemically infused, and we got, you know, amino acid or protein or whatever created. How did it have the capacity to reproduce before it died? How long does something like that exist?
Yeah, it's very likely that life got started or at least what we would identify as life, got started several times before one of them started reproducing properly. The simple fact of the matter is, when we talk about the origin of life, is that the life is made of 4 major macromolecules: proteins, lipids, carbohydrates, and nucleic acids. Those macromolecules are made of individual monomers, individual little chemical pieces, and all of those chemical pieces self-assemble. We've seen it happen in laboratory settings. We have found all of these pieces in space where there isn't anybody fudging the numbers or contaminating the vials. So all of the things, all of the building blocks of life, we find in space all the time. They self-assemble by themselves. All that has to happen is that they bump into each other in the right way. And for a long time, that was the sticking point for creationists. They would say, well, you know how to make a few amino acids, and you know how to make a few, nitrogenous bases and things, but you don't know how they assembled each other. Well, now we're starting to get that too. There was a paper, I think, last year showing how basic proteins self-assemble from just and there is a paper this year about how nucleic acids start to build basic RNAs or basic polynucleotide sequences, and through certain minerals cause it to happen, very common minerals. And proteins start to elongate because they're on the surface tension of tiny microdroplets of water. And we're filling in these blanks. And it's the exact same thing as we're talking about here with evolution. Well, you didn't see the whole process. But if I have a 10-step process and I know steps 2, 3, 5, 7, 8, and 9, and you're looking at me and saying, yeah, but you don't have 5, so you don't know anything. I don't get how that's reasonable to you, when you wouldn't do that with any other theory. You wouldn't do that with germ theory. You wouldn't do that with plate tectonics. You wouldn't do that with cell theory. You wouldn't do that with a murder trial. But right now with this one thing, you're saying if you don't know the entire thing, whole start to finish, then you don't know it at all and you shouldn't believe it. Why? I think it's because you have been given a really, really crappy version of evolution, something that sounds stupid. Everything you've said to me sounds insane. I wouldn't believe it either with what you've been saying to me. So I think that you've been done a disservice. I think somebody taught you a crappy, watered down version of evolution that doesn't make any sense. And you, as a reasonable person, said, this is dumb. Why would anybody believe this crap? And I think at the end of the day, the issue here is that you haven't had a reason to be exposed to any of this stuff, but you're still giving it more criticism than you would any other theory simply because your faith is tangled into it. Is that fair to say, or do you think that I'm misrepresenting you?
Yeah, absolutely fair. I won't deny that. I go back to the flat earther thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same thing for me. I'd look at that and I go, these people, they won't accept this. The earth is round. It's just insane. I look at people that believe in evolution and I think that, they're wrong, but they have the right to present their arguments and everything like that. Let's not suppress things. Let's bring us up and say, this is a possibility. This maybe is how this all works. But what I object to is when you have someone comes into a college and they say, you got to ditch your Christianity because that doesn't fly with biology here. And you can't have your paper peer processed, peer reviewed because you're bringing God into the equation, and we don't let that happen.
Wouldn't you want it to be that way? That's the best way for it to. So first of all, nobody's saying you can't be a Christian in college. I have friends, like I said, my first master's was in bioanthro, studying human evolution. The person who worked at the desk right next to me was one of the most evangelical people I've ever met, and was very adamant that the human evolution that we studied in that lab was the work of a God. And so that happens all the time. But in terms of saying, I won't publish your paper because you put God in it, yeah, because that's a totally different hypothesis that you then need to provide a totally new set of evidence for, especially if you're picking a particular God. You can't just say, there's a God. You're saying, I have to prove the God exists. I have to prove that it's this specific God that I'm talking about. I have to prove that they have the ability to create a thing. Then I have to prove that they did it. Then I have to explain the mechanisms by which they did it. If you throw that into a paper without all that evidence, yeah, of course it wouldn't get reviewed. It has nothing to do with criticism of religion.
I'm not suggesting that this paper was contained that kind of information. It's just the fact who the writer of the thing was, who may be bringing doubts. You're familiar with Discovery Institute, and you talked about Stephen Meyer.
Yeah.
Their whole thing was, one of the things that turns people off is religion. And bringing God up says let's attack this thing from a non-religious perspective, and let's just look at this and see if. And then they came up with the term intelligent design. And we look at nature, we go, Dawkins has admitted this. He said, it looks like things have been designed.
Right.
And so
don't you understand that?
They say, okay, let's look at the theory of evolution, and let's look at how it really matches up with evidence. Now you talk about fossils. You say, well, we got the fossils. Show me the fossils. I've read lots of people saying, you don't have. Why would you be looking for the missing link if it's not missing?
Because the missing link.
We found the missing link.
Yeah. Well, it's because the missing link is just a creationist talking point. It's not a real thing. If I have fossil here and fossil here, they say, well, where's the link between them? And so I find this one. And they say, well, now there's two gaps. And so I find these two. And they say, look, there's all these gaps, all these missing links. And that's what happens all the time. But the thing is about this, and that's a whole other discussion. We're already, we've been talking for 2 hours. I don't want to take your whole day. I'm happy to talk to you as long as you like, but I don't want to keep you here forever. But the thing is, when you talk about, well, they're not going to get published. They're going to be, not going to get a job at university. They're going to be not able to teach. They're not a good scientist, blah, blah, blah. Would you trust a doctor who, came to you and they said, hey, you're really sick. Looks like you have some sort of cancer. The major medical consensus that all these experts and all these universities says is, we need to do radiation, we need to do chemotherapy, we need to do surgery. But you know what? I believe in this other thing, and I think that we need to just start, eating more pears, and pears are going to fix it, and that's all you need. Or would you say this person needs to go with the best medical evidence available? And that's the same thing here, is that you're saying, well, somebody can't put God in a paper because nobody's proven that. That's not a scientific question in this way. So if you're going to come into and publish a paper and say, hey, everything that every biologist publishes is wrong. Everything that every university understands is wrong. Everything in all these textbooks is wrong. It's actually this. And not back that up with just a mountain of it, that would be huge news. So of course it wouldn't get published. And I don't think you would want it published either. If a geologist came out with a paper saying, hey, plate tectonics isn't real, and actually it's just some other thing, you wouldn't want that getting out there. You wouldn't want that person being taken seriously unless they had something to back it up with. If they had a reason to believe it, great. But if they don't, why do it? That's my issue with the Discovery Institute and people like that, is that they're not giving evidence for God or creationism or anything. They're finding reasons why they don't like evolution. And that's fine. But it's not either or. Even if you could completely debunk evolution, you haven't done a single thing to prove creationism. That's a completely different question that needs its own evidence.
Well,
and yet
their goal is to prove that we are intelligently designed. And
they've gotten nothing so far.
That brings up the question then, if at that point, well, who designed us? Who designed the designer? I mean, it's like a dog chasing his tail around.
Exactly.
There's no end.
So with evolution, right. So with evolution, we know the mechanism, we see evidence for it, we see ways that it works, we can watch it happen before our very eyes. And there are some things that we don't know. There's always going to be. That's the best part about science, is every time you answer a question, you find 3 more questions. But we're not trying to reinvent the wheel here by showing actually not only is everything we know about biology wrong, but also there's this supernatural world and there's a guy that lives there and he did this and that and the other thing because and also the Bible is true, and also this. These are so many layers that you're adding on to a simple question of whether or not you just believe the evidence on the ground. I don't understand why that's good enough for you in this particular case, when I don't think I give you the courtesy of saying I don't think that would be good enough for you in any other situation.
Maybe.
Can you forgive me? I don't want to pressure you, but like, can you give me any other way, any other time in your entire life where you would use the same kind of thinking that you're using here for evolution for literally anything else?
Well, maybe that example you just gave about chemotherapy.
Yeah. If somebody came along and said, I don't believe in one.
Has science proved that cancer is caused by an absence or a lack of chemotherapy in our body?
No, it's a mutation that causes cells to over-reproduce. And the thing about chemotherapy, what it actually does, the reason why it's so problematic, we know that cancer cells are dividing super rapidly and that they're taking too many resources and they're not controlled. Your cells have this thing called apoptosis, which is like pre-planned cell death. And so your cancer cells are just dividing like crazy. They're not dying. They're taking up your resources. And so the reason why chemotherapy works and the reason why it's so damn miserable to go through it, the reason your hair falls out, you get sick and all these things, we don't have a drug right now that specifically just can target those cancer cells, because almost every cancer cell is different. One tumor has like 5 different kinds of cancer in it. That's why it's so hard to cure, because cancer can be caused in so many ways. And it's so different, so rapidly dividing and rapidly mutating. So instead, chemotherapy drugs target rapidly dividing cells. That's what it's killing. It's cells in the process of division. And so it's really good at killing those cancer cells, but it also hurts all the other cells in your body that are rapidly dividing, like the ones in your hair follicles, the one in your GI tract, things like that. And so this is why you get all these other negative side effects. So chemotherapy is a solution to cancer. It's not the only one, and it's hopefully not going to be the last one. We have amazing new advances in cancer drugs over the past decade, especially. I have some friends who are doing research on cancer drugs right now, and like the really hard part is getting enough of them funded to go to trials. We have so many amazing things that could be way better than chemo. But as it is right now, of course, not having chemotherapy doesn't cause cancer. It just so happens that chemotherapy is really good at targeting cells that behave like cancer cells. And so it works a lot of the times for that. And so that's the thing. If you had a doctor that came along today and said, hey, I'm going to cure your cancer some other way, you would want some evidence for that. You'd want a reason to believe that. You wouldn't accept it for him to just say, listen, I don't know the connection between chemotherapy and cancer. It doesn't really make any sense to me. I think the guys who published this are funded by some evil corporation. I don't like the guy. I haven't read it. I don't know about it, but I think this other thing's going to work. You would never accept that. You would never put your life in that person's hands. And it's the same thing here. Is when it comes to, I don't think you've studied germ theory or plate tectonic theory or cell theory or any of these other things, but you know enough about them to say, all right, this kind of makes sense. And there's a lot of stuff that these eggheads have studied and they'll figure out the rest. But when it comes to evolution, you give it a completely different shakedown and you say, I don't know all these things and it doesn't really make sense to me. Therefore, there's this conspiracy within the academia to kick out anybody who believes in God. And that's just not reasonable.
Have you seen the movie Expelled?
Yes, it's disgusting. Yes, I have.
All right. Well, I mean, that's evidence that this has happened. Maybe it doesn't happen in every institution, but it has happened. There has prejudice.
So let's take the most benign claim that Expelled makes, because Expelled makes some absolutely disgusting claims. But the most benign claim that it makes is that sometimes in some universities, some Christians are persecuted and not allowed to teach. Is that a fair assessment? Am I straw manning it at all?
I think it's accurate.
Okay. So then the conclusion here is that some people are assholes. And then what? Because at the end of the day, medicine relies on evolution. If we don't understand evolution, we don't have antibiotics. We don't have vaccines. We don't understand how most modern medicine works without evolution. Agriculture relies on evolution. We don't have good crops of that evolution.
Well,
We don't understand it. Like,
we don't have to understand we don't have to have macro evolution in order for penicillin to work, or antibiotics.
No, of course not. But the point of the matter is, microevolution and macroevolution are just two sides of the same coin. As I've said before, if you have enough microevolution, you end up with macroevolution. In the same way that if I walk 5 feet enough times, I will walk a mile. And so the little changes become big changes, and that works out. And that's what we see in the fossil record. That's what we see in the genetic record. That's what we see in homologous structures. That's what we see in the embryological structures like that. These are things that we see over and over all around us. So yeah, if somebody's going to come into an academic institution trying to be an educator and a researcher, and they start the conversation by saying, I think that the central theory of this discipline is wrong, and they don't have anything to back it up with, could you expect them to be employed? Yeah, maybe some people are persecuted for their religion. That sucks. That's wrong, and that should never happen. My experience, it's the opposite. People are actually a lot more willing to accept different ideas and different worldviews, especially nowadays. It certainly wasn't historically the case, but modern times a lot more so. But either way, at the end of the day, what's important in science is evidence. And if somebody's going to come in here saying, all of your evidence doesn't work for me, and I have something that I believe that I don't have evidence for, you're not a good scientist. So expelled, it doesn't do anything for me. The most damning thing you can say about expelled is that some people behave badly. That doesn't change science, and that doesn't change evidence, and that doesn't change what we're able to draw from the theory of evolution.
I guess we are in a position where we have to agree to disagree.
We are over time, I mean, and if you need to go, it's okay.
Yes.
Well,
yeah.
Well, okay. So like that's it. We are over time. So if you have to go, we can wrap up now. But I want to ask about that, what you just said. So are we okay to go a little further, or do you want to wrap up? I'll leave it entirely up to you. You're my guest.
Well, if you have another question that's pressing, if you got a question that you want to answer, go for it.
That's I would like to ask that. Like, I think like you've given me a lot of challenges here, and I know I've talked a lot, but like you've given me a lot of challenges, and I think I've addressed all of them. And if I'm missing something, I want to know. If you think there's something that I haven't adequately broached, then please tell me. But it sounds like to me, a minute ago, you said you don't think I'll ever be able to meet these questions to your satisfaction. It sounds to me like you've decided that going in rather than actually taking anything that I've said as into consideration.
Well, you're very convincing. You're very, very, very knowledgeable. I will admit, and you seem to be a great guy. I mean, you're willing to entertain doubts.
Always.
It's just that I just let me put it this way.
Sure.
Want to hear conspiracy theories here? What if there is a God, and what if there is an enemy of God, who we may name Satan, the devil?
Sure.
And his primary goal is to make sure you don't go to heaven, and that you don't love the God that he hates, his enemy.
Yeah.
And so he weaves this web of deceit to try to keep you off course. What if that were the case, and that all the people that embrace that they were not created by a God were influenced by this whole conspiracy to stop you from reaching heaven?
Yeah.
If that was true, you'd be sitting here deceived, correct? You would have fallen into the trap. You would have fallen in the trap. You know, the ironic thing about being
when you say that
ignorant,
is that a rhetorical thing, or do you actually want my actual response to that scenario? because I don't
Well,
want to. If you have a different one you're getting to,
you threw me a curveball. You said you don't want to go to heaven. It sounds like an awful place. So that one, I mean, that just totally throws my whole paradigm off. I don't even understand that mentality.
I would be more than happy to have that conversation with you if you want. I think with this particular video, I'd like to keep it just to evolution, because on my channel, I talk about religion from time to time. It comes up, but I have whole shows where I do atheism, and I don't want to make my channel I don't want people thinking I'm attacking religious people or on that. Yeah. So like, if you want to have that talk, I'm super down with that. We can stick around after we're done filming this if you'd like. But like, no, that's the thing, is that like, when you say that, are you actually asking for my real response to that situation? Or are you just saying like, you could be misled, like rhetorically?
Well, I mean, it doesn't matter what your response is. Like you said, that doesn't change the truth.
Sure.
The truth is
that's
the truth.
Why I'm asking. I mean, I don't know if you want me to elaborate.
So if the only question I had for you is if the scenario I laid out is true, then you're being deceived. And you said, yes, that would be true.
Yeah,
so
that would be. Yeah.
That's
and I think the first two words. Yeah, well, that's the thing. The first two words of that scenario summarize the scenario. What if?
What if?
What if? Do you have any evidence that I can test for that?
Well, that's the journey I've been on since I had that prayer experience. That was coming up on 18 years ago. All the things that I've studied and learned since then has pointed me to that direction, that's what's going on here. That a lot of Christians discount the devil. I mean, he's just a boogeyman. So it's like, if there really is a devil, he's a pretty smart dude, and his MO is deceit. So, and the thing is, life is like Final Jeopardy. We got the Final Jeopardy question. What is heaven? Is it a myth or is it reality? And so we all have our answer, and we sit and listen to the Jeopardy theme song playing as we go 30 years, 40 years, whatever it is. And then we die and we find out what the answer is. But the trouble is, we can't change the answer once that's happened. We find out, and the thing I always tell the atheists, I say, well, if you're dead when you're dead, you say, well, we'll find out then. And I go, well, no, you won't, because, I mean, if there is no God and you're just dead, you won't know the answer, because it's just dead. Nihilism, nothing there. But if God does exist, then you'll know the answer, and you'll know that the answer that you had was wrong, and you got a whole eternity to regret it. Now, you get into the whole thing about hell and flames and stuff like that. That's a whole nother can of worms. But
that's just Pascal's wager. That's just saying, if I believe and it turns out to be true, then I'm saved. And if I believe and it turns out not to be true, it makes no difference. But if I don't believe and it turns out to be true, then I'm in trouble. But if I don't believe it, it's better just to believe. But like, you don't do the same thing with every other possible hell. There's over 2,000 denominations of Christianity alone, many of which conflate or conflict with each other. There's thousands upon thousands of different Christians out there, types of Christianity, that think that you've got it wrong and that you'll go to hell, and you're not worried about them, and you're not making the same accountability for them. And there's plenty of, you're not worried about the hell of Islam, you're not worried about Hinduism, you're not worried about Zoroastrianism, you're not worried about the Aztec hell, you're not worried about any of the other hells. You just think that this is the one, and so you're going to stick with it. And I think it was Bertrand Russell said, even if you could be sure that one religion was true, everybody should expect damnation by probability alone. And so, like, for me, at the end of the day, all you've given me here is what if. What if there's a God? And what if there's a hell? And what if there's this and this? And all I've given you is evidence. Here's evolution happening before your eyes. Here's the mechanisms of it. Here's what we know about DNA. Here's what we know about mutations. Here's the fossils that we can see. Here's the embryos we can see. Here's the genetics we can see. Here's all these things that we can see really, and we can put these puzzle pieces together, and it works like this. And all I've got from you is, well, what if you're wrong? What if I am? Then at least I know. Then I used my brain to the best of my abilities, and I read the evidence on the ground. If you have evidence for any of this other stuff, of the supernatural world, of a God, of a devil, or anything like that, I'd take it into account. But as it stands, what I have evidence for is natural world, and what I don't have evidence for is a supernatural world.
And my
So
question to
why
you
would I
is,
believe something I don't have evidence for?
how deeply have you researched into finding that evidence? I mean, there are a myriad of people that have said they died and went to heaven or hell for a short period of time and came back to earth.
Yep.
I mean, one of the greatest testimonies that we find is you take a man who's an absolute criminal. Like there's a woman in Hong Kong. She finds people that are heroin addicts, which I mean, the government doesn't know how to take care of these people. How do you cure a person who's a heroin addict? And she is bringing these people back to life through prayer. I mean, you look
So
at
let me
people's
ask you,
lives that are changed dramatically from being, whatever it is that they are, to being a totally different person. That's an evidence. Now you can say, well, it's circumstantial evidence.
no, it's
Well, to
not.
me,
It's not evidence. See, that's the thing.
oh,
Either,
you're going
something is
to
either
define
something
what
is true or
evidence
it
is
isn't.
here.
Well, yeah, well, we have to. But otherwise, anything could
Well,
be evidence and we could believe anything. So, like, either something is true or it isn't. Whether or not somebody believes it doesn't make it true. Whether or not it helps somebody's life doesn't make it true. Whether or not it's written in an old book doesn't make it true. Whether or not somebody had a vision of it doesn't make it true. It's either true or it isn't. And we have to have better evidence than just someone saying it. If I told you right now there was somebody living in India that was teaching people about evolution and getting them off of heroin, you certainly wouldn't think that was evidence of evolution. And yet, when it comes to your religion, you say, okay, well, clearly prayer works. When at the end of the day, we've done actual laboratory experiments over prayer, and we haven't found any reason to believe that it's real. It either works exactly at the same rate of chance or worse. And so, like, either this, the prayer thing, either it doesn't work or it really doesn't like having calculators around it. And that's, for me, just not good enough. So if you have actual evidence that's something that we can observe and test and repeat and like quantify and something we can actually put to puzzle together, I'll hear it. But otherwise, visions, prayers, a powerful feeling, a near-death experience, these are things that we can actually explain by naturalistic means. And those naturalistic means can be tested and repeated and done in a laboratory setting, and we get the same results. You talk about near-death experiences. What about all the near-death experiences of the people who have different religions than you that claim that they saw their gods when they died? Do you think that they were telling the truth and there's all these different gods up there? What about people who didn't have a near-death experience? They almost died and they didn't see anything. Does that mean that there's nothing? Or that's just they didn't have access to it, or they didn't die the right way? What about my grandma? My grandma died of dementia. Did little pieces of her mind go to heaven at a time, or did it all go at once and it was locked away somewhere? Like, these are all things that, like, when you look at it at face value, like you're doing, sure, you can paint a pretty picture, but it's not actual evidence. And what I'm giving you as science is actual evidence that we can quantify and test and repeat and observe, and it matters. And just like with all the plumbers disappeared, if all the biologists disappeared tomorrow, we would still find the same evidence and still be able to come to the same answer. If all the religious people disappeared tomorrow, you'd have a different religion the next day.
well, this is the conundrum that we face in our world.
Yeah.
Like I said,
Hundreds of thousands of years, and we haven't gotten it yet.
We all choose our final Jeopardy answers. Some people are in the midst of changing their answer as they go on. Some people that were believers embrace evolution and atheism, and other people that are atheists go the other direction. It's just a crazy world we live in.
Yep. Sure. But at the beginning of this call, you said that it mattered to you whether what you believe in is true. And it matters to me too. So my question to you then is, does this matter too? Does it matter whether or not you believe in the supernatural thing or evolution or all these things? Does it matter if they're true, or have you just decided what you want to believe?
Well, I didn't come to my decision on what I believe without any evidence whatsoever. But the problem is that you're not going to accept that as evidence. So to your way of thinking, I'm deluded right off the get-go there. So you want evidence to be what you define it to be. So
it's not just me. It's not evidence that you would accept either for anything else. You would not accept the evidence that you're giving me for your faith. And the reason you'd reject evolution, you would not accept that if I posed it to you for any other thing. So again, it sounds to me like you have decided that this is the only way to be, and that evolution has to be wrong because your religion has to be right. And what I'm trying to tell you is, number one, these are two different questions. You can have both at the same time. Lots of people do. But at the end of the day, no matter what I believe to be true matters. I want to make sure I believe as many true things and as few false things as possible. And I have evidence. I have a reason to believe. Yeah, I have a reason to believe in evolution. And I hate that word believe. I'm using it for just the sort of sake of simplicity here. But I have a reason to understand that evolution is true. I don't have a reason to believe anything else. And so I don't. And I stick with what I got. And if I die and I find out that there was this, all this supernatural stuff, at least I'll be happy knowing that I used my brain. And I didn't have a reason to believe it, so I didn't. And I wasn't misled by BS. Because some, charlatan came down the road, saying, buy this snake oil. You don't have to believe it. It cured some lady in India who was on heroin. And I go, okay, like I have to have evidence, right? So that's the whole thing. Is like it matters to me that what I believe is true. And I have evidence for this, and I don't have evidence for what you're saying. And the evidence of what you're saying wouldn't work for anything else for you either. So I don't understand. I think if we're being honest with ourselves here, I think that I think you've made a judgment about it before, about evolution specifically, without actually knowing what it is. And I think that's a major issue for me. So that's why I wanted to have this conversation with you. And you say we want to agree to disagree. I don't think we have to, man. I really don't. I think you and I can really get along here. I think you and I can come to some agreements if we just, settle down on what evolution or what evidence is. I assumed you had something to say to me. I'd say back to that. I wasn't going to keep talking to you or just talking at you.
I'm speechless. So,
okay. Well, I tell you what, we're already like 30 minutes over time. Let me ask you one more question, and then I'll be done. If you want to ask me anything else, that's fine. One more question.
All right.
What would change your mind? Is there anything at all that would change your mind on evolution?
You sound like the used car salesman. What can I say to sell you this car today that you drive this car out? I just want to know. Lot?
Yeah, I just want to know what would actually change your mind.
I don't think you can.
Okay.
I hope not, Forrest. I hope you can't change my mind.
Okay. Yeah, that. I think that's the fundamental difference. That's everything that I just said is that you could change my mind. I hope you do. The best thing about being a scientist is being wrong, because it means you learn a new thing. I've been wrong about all sorts of shit over the course of my life, and I'm better every day. There are so many things that I believe now and that I know now that I would never have thought would be real 5, 10, 15 years ago. Learning new things is my bread and butter. It's the most important thing in my life. So here's the difference between us, it seems, is that I am ready to accept new evidence. And you just said, not only do you not think it's possible, you hope it isn't. I think that's the main difference.
No, I didn't. What I said, I hope I don't ever change my mind because I'm afraid or because I want to conform or whatever.
Right. Yeah. So you hope that I can't change your mind.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's the whole question we just had.
Because I think I've got the truth and I just need to hang on to it. So, because your truth leads to nothing. So
that's
what you, and you're a self-professed nihilist. That doesn't bother you in the least, because it's like, see, one of the things I see in nature is that self-preservation is one of the strongest instincts that we have, self-preservation. But for you not to want to be preserved for eternal life, for you to not to think that you can continue. You got all this knowledge and information in your head and all the good things that you've developed over the years, to think that it's just going to go and be gone. That just blows my mind that you don't want it to continue. I
don't think I'm important enough for that.
Oh, my brother, you are.
I'm not. No, I disagree wholeheartedly. In fact, I find that assertion to be deeply problematic. But that's the thing, man. You're talking about, that's the argument from consequences. It's a logical fallacy. If this is true, then I don't like the outcome. Doesn't mean that it isn't true. So at the end of the day, I don't care if what I believe, or I don't care if the truth makes me sad. I just want to make sure I know the truth. I don't care if the truth is terrible. I want to know the truth. And so I'm looking at the evidence as it is, and I'm drawing truth from it as best I can. And if I'm wrong, and indeed, I believe I probably am wrong about lots of things, either a little bit or a lot, but I'm going to keep looking for the truth, and I'm going to keep getting more right over and over and over throughout the course of my life. I'm going to get more and more right as I go along, instead of digging in my heels and saying, this is the thing that I believe, and I will not allow anything to change my mind. And I'm stuck right here forever.
Okay, a pointed question.
Yes.
Have you ever personally, you talked about trying to find prayer in the laboratory. Have you ever got down on your knees and said, Lord, if this evolution stuff is all wrong, correct me, and meant it?
I've never said exactly those words, but I have explored religion in my life, yes.
Yeah, well, there's a difference. Religion is a man-made subject. God is a person. So,
but I used to believe in a personal divine entity thing, and I went through different names. At one point in my life when I was young, I did believe in a more or less Christian God.
Right. It's, when we're kids, I mean, it's like when your parents tell you, you believed in the Easter Bunny and the Tooth Fairy and that to the Santa Claus until you reach a certain age. And so then you kind of conflate them. You say, well, they were wrong about Santa Claus. They were wrong about the Easter, but I guess they're wrong about God too. And unfortunately, that happened.
It wasn't exactly that, but that is a good analogy. I wasn't taught to believe in any of those things, but my family was had a diversity of religions and cultures, and so I was exposed to a lot of them. And like I said, this is a whole other conversation that I would like to have.
Oh my God, it's a can of worms to get in the world of religion.
We'll be here for another 2 hours.
Oh, years.
Donald, let's. I think we were going for 2.5 hours, and that, like I said, that's a whole other thing. I would actually like to talk to you about it, but not right now, or at least not in this video. Is there anything else you want to ask me? Nope. Is there anything else you want to ask me before we wrap up? Okay. Nope. Is there anything that I didn't address that you think I should cover before we wrap up?
You covered a lot of things, and you covered it quite well.
Oh, thank you. That means a lot. I tend to ramble. Okay, I just want to make sure that we're good on both ends, and that I'm not cutting you off or leaving anything on the table that you wish we had gotten more into. All right. Well, then with that, I want to sincerely thank you for your time. Seriously, this has been